Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. I recognize the Premier.
Here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, through you and to all members of this Assembly. I have the very distinct pleasure of rising today to introduce a very special foreign dignitary that's visiting our province and visiting our legislature today, Mr. Speaker. In your gallery from Norway, from the community of Storhovdal, is Deputy Mayor Linda Ottnes Henriksen, who I had the opportunity to meet earlier. As well as we have our very own Moose Jaw Mayor Fraser Tolmie, and I believe Craig Hemingway is there as well from the Mayor's office. Mr. Speaker, earlier today we had the opportunity to sit down and discuss matters of great international importance, I must say, including the most recently declared moose truce between our two communities. I'd like all members to join me, Mr. Speaker, in welcoming Deputy Mayor Linda Ottnes Henriksen and Mayor Fraser Tolmie to the Saskatchewan Legislative Assembly, and thank them for the conversation that they have been part of for the last number of weeks. And Mr. Speaker, while I'm on my feet, I'd take the opportunity to introduce a couple of fellows that really don't need any introduction in this legislature, in this province, or possibly even in the community of Las Vegas. Mr. Speaker, we have Justin Rivas and Greg Moore, also known as Justin and Greg. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take a moment to welcome them to their Legislative Assembly. As we know, these two are active ambassadors for our province, and we thank them for showcasing our province everywhere they go in everything they do. I've had the opportunity to be live on the Justin and Greg show earlier last year. I had the opportunity to play the game Bamboozled, of which I would recommend to absolutely no one. Mr. Speaker, I also had the opportunity to have a wager of which I lost, Mr. Speaker, and I had to don a Vegas Golden Knights jersey in my office as the Vegas Golden Knights just squeaked a little bit of a win past my Edmonton Oilers. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Justin and Greg for their efforts on social media to garner this moose truce that we have here this week and garner our province and the community of Moose Jaw and our relationship with Norway more international attention, and I want all members to help me welcome Justin and Greg to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
I request leave for extended introduction.
Members asked leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure this afternoon to rise and, along with the Premier, on behalf of the official opposition, welcome this delegation from Norway, Mayor Ottnes Henriksen, Deputy Mayor, to this Legislative Assembly. And thank you and Mayor Tolmie from Moose Jaw and the people in both of your communities for providing some much appreciated fun and levity in the midst of what has been the coldest winter on record for most of us here in this Assembly, and for showing us how international relations can be broached with a bit of fun and seriousness at the same time. And I wish both of your communities all the best in terms of the tourism and the notoriety that you've come to enjoy right across not only this country but right across the world. I also would like to join with the Premier in welcoming our guests Justin and Greg to their Legislative Assembly. I'd like to let you know, I think my nephew would never forgive me if I didn't let you know that he is the most solid Golden Knights fan in Meadow Lake. So you've got one up there and welcome them to their assembly. And lastly, but not least, Mr. Speaker, I would also like to introduce two other guests located in your gallery, Mr. Speaker. With us today are Caitlin Bitternose and Summer Cardinal, who are with the Canadian Roots Exchange. I'll have an opportunity to introduce them a little more with a little more depth soon, but very excited to have you here in your Legislative Assembly. And on behalf of all members of the official opposition, I invite all members of the Assembly to welcome these important guests to this Assembly.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the member from Moose Jaw, Waccamaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join the Premier and the members opposite, welcoming Deputy Mayor Linda Otnes Henriksen from Norway, and one of my favorite constituents, Mayor Fraser Tolmie from Moose Jaw, and it's always good to have him here in the legislature, and as per a little wager, I'm good this time, and I'd like to say hi to Justin Gregg as well.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I take a real honor and pleasure introducing 27 grade 8 students from Caswell Community School. Now they're up in the East Gallery giving a wave. This is a pretty special school. This is a school where I taught for a few years in the 1990s. It's been some 20 years. That's where I got my start debating and refining my speech making. The poor kids in grade 8 who had to listen to me talk about social studies. So I just want to say welcome to your legislature. They're joined with their teachers Susan Lutkin and Ms. Brittany Fafard, and parent chaperones Tammy Sweet, Sheldon Hahn, Fiona Johnson, and Carol Tabay. So welcome to your legislature, and we'll be seeing you after and we can talk further. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Moose Jaw North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to join with the Premier and the member opposite and my colleague from Waccamaw in welcoming the Mayor and Linda to the Legislative Assembly. Mayor Fraser told me he's our favorite mayor. Thank him for his leadership and his enthusiasm. And to Linda Otnes Henrik, welcome here to Canada, welcome to Moose Jaw. We had a nice little event on Saturday night, the Prism Awards, which is the entrepreneurship of women in Moose Jaw, and she was there, and she was presented with a very nice little plaque from a local artist from the late Gus Froese, and accepted very well. I'm just a little afraid that she'll take it back to Norway and have it chromed. But other than that, thank you for being here. It's certainly a pleasure to have you here.
Recognize the member from Saskatchewan Rivers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce some very special guests in the Legislative Assembly today. Seated in the Speaker's Gallery, as well as the West Gallery, are the Saskatchewan Francescois community. And with us today is Mr. Denis Simard. Please give away, Denis. President of the Assembly of the Communauté Territoire Francescois, as well as the Executive Director, Ronald Lebrec. And those smiling, inquisitive faces are the grade 7 students from here in Regina. Accompanying the teachers, the students, is their teacher, Claude Martel. Hello, Claude. And I'll be speaking further in a member statement today. So I ask all members to join me in welcoming our guests to their Legislative Assembly today. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon, Nutana.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais dire bienvenue à tous et toutes qui est ici pour le mois de mars, le mois de célébration de la francophonie à Saskatchewan. Et comme le président de section de cette assemblée pour l'Assemblée parlementaire de la francophonie, je voudrais dire que votre travail est très, très important pour encourager le parler de la langue française, et je voudrais dire merci beaucoup pour tout votre travail. Merci.
Recognize the member from Cannington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you to the Assembly. I would like to make an introduction, but first I would like to say bienvenue à tous la francophonie et welcome to your assembly. I'd like to introduce, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chris Carley, seated in your gallery. Chris is a town councillor for the town of Cardiff, has been a volunteer firefighter for about 17 years and chaired the EMO in Cardiff, as well as a parent to some aspiring hockey players, Mr. Speaker, and is a businessman in the oil patch down around Cardiff. But Chris is here today because he has turned his papers in today to seek the nomination for the Saskatchewan party in the Cannington constituency when the election is called, Mr. Speaker. I will be here to remind you of the rules until that point, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I would ask members to welcome Chris to his assembly.
As a member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with colleagues on both sides of the House in welcoming the members from the OCF, but in particular, I'd like to recognize the president of the OCF, Denis Simard, who's here today. Not only is he a constituent of mine, but when I first met him, he was executive director of the Eastview Community Association, which is a community in my riding. Not only is he active in the French community, but he's well known in the city for his volunteerism. So even though he's not filling that role at the community association anymore, he's still heavily involved in the board and heavily involved in the events that they put on, and I think he should be recognized for that work as well. He's also busy in his job working for the Habitat for Humanity Restore, which he's done an incredible job of growing and continues to grow. And it's always great to see him fill these incredible roles. I don't know how he finds all of the time to do all of the things he does, but I'm happy to see that he's here today, and I'd like to ask all members to join me in, again, welcoming him to his Legislative Assembly.
Bravo.
So we recognize the member from Melville Saltcoats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I too would like to welcome two very distinct members of the Canadian Roots organization, Youth Reconciliation Leaders. I think two fantastic individuals who really want to contribute to the betterment of leadership between First Nations and Canada. We've got Caitlin Bitternose, who's from the George Gordon First Nation, and we've got Summerley Cardinal, who is actually here from Alberta. She's from the Saddle Lake Cree Nation Treaty 6 territory from Alberta. I'd like to welcome both of them to the Saskatchewan Legislative Assembly and thank them for their great work in being student youth leaders in the province.
Presenting petitions. I recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present petitions once again on behalf of concerned citizens and businesses and communities all across Saskatchewan as it relates to the hike and the expansion of the PST onto construction labor, Mr. Speaker. This is the epitome of a job-killing tax, and sadly the numbers are bearing that out. Our construction sector has been beleaguered and hit and hurt by this imposition. Permits are down across the province. Jobs are down across the province. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, so many Saskatchewan workers, skilled labor that will be needed to build Saskatchewan have been forced to move from the province because of the hurt within this sector, Mr. Speaker. We're calling on the government, of course, to scrap its ill-conceived and damaging imposition of the PST onto construction labor. The prayer reads as follows. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop saddling families and businesses with the costs of their mismanagement and immediately reinstate the PST exemption on construction and stop hurting Saskatchewan businesses and families. These petitions are signed by concerned residents of Regina. I so submit.
Recognize the member from Swift Current.
Here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. And I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action: to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this particular petition is signed by the good citizens of Swift Current, Saskatchewan, Canada. I do so present.
Here.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling on the Sask Party to stop the cuts to our children's classrooms. Mr. Speaker, those who have signed this petition wish to draw our attention to some following items: that the fact that successive years of budget cuts and underfunding have caused deep deficits in classrooms right across the province, and that they continue to provide hardships, and that has ensured that there are children who are getting less than the standard of education that they deserve. Mr. Speaker, I'll read the prayer. We, the undersigned, call upon the government to reverse the senseless cuts to our kids' classrooms and stop making families, teachers, and everyone who works to support our education system pay the price for the Sask Party's mismanagement. Mr. Speaker, those who have signed this petition today reside in La Ronge. I do so present.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon, Newtana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition calling for a public inquiry into the GTH land deal. The people who signed this petition want to bring to our attention the following. The Sask Party government has unequivocally refused to come clean on the GTH land deal, a deal where Sask Party government insiders made millions flipping land and taxpayers lost millions. And instead of shining a bright light on the issue and calling for a public inquiry, the Sask Party government is instead hiding behind excuses around public prosecutions in Manitoba. The Sask Party government continues to unequivocally block key witnesses from providing testimony about the land deal, and it's Saskatchewan people who footed the bill for the GTH land deal and deserve nothing less than the truth. I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to stop hiding behind partisan excuses and immediately call for a judicial inquiry and a forensic audit into the GTH land deal, Mr. Speaker. And the folks who have signed this petition today come from City Regina and Kenora, Mr. Speaker. I so submit.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics. And the people signing this petition, the residents of the province of Saskatchewan, want to bring to our attention the following: that Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, and even those outside this province, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties. And you know, Mr. Speaker, the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. But, you know, Mr. Speaker, over the past 10 years, the Saskatchewan Party has received over $12 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.87 million came from companies outside Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people. But yet the federal government and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and even British Columbia now have moved to limit this influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to overhaul Saskatchewan's campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. And Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition came from Regina, Melville, Weyburn, and Moose Jaw. I do so present. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today to present a petition calling for pharmacare for Saskatchewan. These citizens wish to bring to our attention that Canada is the only country with a universal health care system that doesn't include prescription drug coverage, and that this oversight results in unnecessary illness and suffering and costs us billions. that over 90% of Canadians agree that we need a national pharmacare program, which makes sense as 1 in 5 Canadians don't fill necessary prescriptions because medications cost too much. And when we cover essential medications, we improve people's quality of life and save millions in downstream costs. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to immediately support the establishment of universal pharmacare for Saskatchewan patients and advocate for a national pharmacare program for all Canadians. This petition is signed by individuals from Moose Jaw and Regina. I do so submit.
Reading and receiving petitions. Why is the member on her feet?
Ask leave for introduction.
Members ask leave for an introduction. Is leave granted? I agree. I recognize the member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce a very dedicated member to our Regina community, Gary Greywalt, seated in the West Gallery. Gary has been a very dedicated volunteer within the Sikh community and has organized the Sikh parade that is very well attended in the summertime here in Regina, and we just appreciate the hard work that Gary puts into not just the Sikh community, but the community of Regina overall. And we all know that we always proudly say that Saskatchewan has got some of the best volunteers, and Gary is a shining example of one of those individuals. So I'd like to welcome Gary to his Legislative Assembly.
I'm assuming you want to join in. I recognize the member for Regina Northeast.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to seek leave for an introduction.
Members asked leave for an introduction. Is leave granted? Agreed. Recognize the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the member opposite in welcoming Gary Greywalt to his assembly here. Although I'm happy that he's up there and not down here. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Greywalt has been a long-standing volunteer in the community with Indie Canada Association and the good work that they have done for our community. And I know all of us here and the citizens of Regina are very appreciative of the work that Gary has contributed to our community.
Why is the member on her feet?
I request leave for an introduction.
Member, the minister has requested leave for an introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize Bruce Evans, who's the mayor of White City. He's seated in the West Gallery here today. Bruce is the leader of a community and part of a bigger community that's one of the fastest growing communities in the province of Saskatchewan. Bruce's dedication to his community and to the province is admirable and noted. Thanks for attending today, Bruce. I ask all members to join me in welcoming Bruce.
Why is the member on his feet?
Leave to introduce a guest.
Member has asked the leave for introduction of guests. Is leave granted? Recognize the member.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to join with the minister opposite in welcoming Bruce Evans, Mayor of White City, to his assembly, an entrepreneur within our province as well, and all-round good person. It's a pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of the official opposition. Thank you.
All right. Statements by members. I recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, last November, over 300 youth from across the country gathered at the University of Saskatchewan to bring youth voices forward in the pivotal discussion around reconciliation. Canadian Roots Exchange is a national organization that trains Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth to form reconciliation teams with a purpose to teach about the effects of colonialism on Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities right across Canada. Mr. Speaker, this province is well represented in this project. In addition to Max Fineday, who serves as the Executive Director of the CRE, former USSU President, and member of the Sweetgrass First Nation, we also have two participants in this project who are with us today, Caitlin Bitternose and Summer Cardinal. Caitlin is from Treaty 4 territory, a member of the George Gordon First Nation, and Summer is from Saddle Lake Cree Nation in Treaty 6 territory located in central Alberta. Both currently live in Regina. Mr. Speaker, these young women share both a passion and a talent for the work of reconciliation. They've undertaken the role of helping citizens understand the history of residential schools and the intergenerational trauma that is part of our shared history. I first had the chance to meet these two young women along with a member from Regina Elphinstone Centre at a reconciliation event that they organized at Luther College here in Regina, and it was a powerful experience. And I also had the chance to host both of them in my office just down the hall a few months ago. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in celebrating the Canadian Roots Exchange and the incredible work taking place here in Saskatchewan and in communities across Canada thanks to the work of these two young women.
Recognize the member for Regina Pasqua.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Riders fans across Saskatchewan and the rest of Canada rejoiced when they heard the fantastic news that the 2020 Grey Cup will be held here in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, I know I speak for many in this Assembly when I say I am excited to show the rest of Canada our great Mosaic Stadium. Since 2017, it has been home to many exciting football games, concerts, and events. We here are still buzzing from the excitement of 101 Grey Cup, where we saw our beloved riders become champions right here on home soil, and would love nothing more than to see our team succeed again at our new stadium. Not only will this be a great celebration for fans, but will also bring the positive economic impact to the city of Regina. Mr. Speaker, it is no secret that Riders fans are the best fans in CFL. Mr. Speaker, I now ask that all members please join me in congratulating the bid committee on successful bid campaign. Let's go, Rider. Thank you, Mr.
Speaker. Recognize the member from Cumberland.
Mr. Speaker, on February the 14th of this year, I was invited by the Lac La Ronge Indian Band, Chief Tammy Cook-Searson, her council, and elders, for the announcement of funding for the Lac La Ronge Wellness, Healing and Recovery Centre. There we were gathered by many northern leaders, chiefs, mayors, councillors, ministers from the province and federal governments. On this day, hundreds of people joined us on the traditional territory of one of the largest First Nations in our province, and some became very emotional. In northern Saskatchewan, we feel the painful gaps in our healthcare system, like suicide rates, which lead the country, in some cases, the world. Last session in this House, I introduced Bill 613, the Saskatchewan Strategy for Suicide Prevention Act. It is my hope that all members will support it, as it would call for stronger legislation with teeth to address the appalling suicide rates. I ask all members to join me in thanking the Lac La Ronge Indian Band, Chief and Council, staff, committee members, and all the people in the North who have been advocating, signing petitions, walking in memory of those lost, speaking out on social media, and about the serious impact of addictions and mental health have on our communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatchewan Rivers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in the House today with our wonderful guests in the gallery to celebrate March as Le Rendezvous de la Francophone, or National Francophonie Month. Earlier today, the Francescois flag was raised in front of the Legislative Building in celebration of this month. As the Legislative Secretary, I have the unique privilege to welcome special guests to our beloved Legislative Building. And I also get to participate in incredible and in meaningful announcements such as this one today. Thus, Mr. Speaker, in honor of this proclamation, for the entire month, 42 Francescois flags will be waving across the Albert Street Bridge for the first time here in Regina. The golden flags will be a constant reminder of the positive contributions the Francescois community has made here in our province of Saskatchewan. In fact, in my constituency of Saskatchewan Rivers, I see the positive impact the Francophonie culture has in the communities of Albertville and Debden. Thank you to all the guests here today. I thoroughly enjoyed meeting with all of you. and good luck to the students for the remainder of the school year, and may you continue to be fantastic ambassadors for the Francophone community here in Saskatchewan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everyone in this place can agree that a real Saskatchewan winter can be very cold and very long. Instead of dwelling on the frigid temperatures, however, a new recreational facility is now open right in the heart of Saskatoon. Mr. Speaker, Optimist Hill is a new state-of-the-art winter playground that will play host to many events and activities. The Hill offers a full range of activities for children and adults with affordable rentals allowing them to ski, toboggan, and even snow tube. This project could not have been completed without the tremendous vision, blood, sweat, and tears from many volunteers, but especially Joe Van Toff, Rob Letts, and Brad Sylvester. Having been born and raised in Saskatoon, sport and physical recreation in the city is something near and dear to my heart. Mr. Speaker, our province will continue to have one of the strongest population growth rates in all of Canada, and with growing communities, sports will continue to be a great way to unite us all. I am confident that with this facility, it will be possible for many new and experienced athletes to show and develop their skills and fulfill their dreams. Mr. Speaker, I now ask that all members to please join me on congratulating Optimist Hill on a successful opening and thank its sponsors for their efforts in helping bring the best recreational facility to Saskatoon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Kenora Pelly.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it has been confirmed. Saskatchewanians are the toughest people around. Not even the extreme cold weathers could stop the annual 20th Priestville and District Mushers Rendezvous held this past February. This year's event featured both a 10-dog race, which had 12 teams, and a 6-dog race, which had 17 teams entered. The winner of the 10-dog race was Carl Knutson of Porcupine Plain. The 6-dog race, which was held over the past 2-day period, which had competitors traveling 10 miles per day, the winner was chosen based on 2-day average times. First place, once again, was the hometown participant, Carl Knutson, besting the other competitors from the Northwest Territories, Manitoba, and as far as France, Mr. Speaker. The 2 days of racing concluded with a variety supper and the Mushers Award at the Priestville Legion Hall. Mr. Speaker, organizers said this year's Mushers Rendezvous was a great success, despite the cold weather. All funds raised for the weekend will go to purchase equipment at the Priestville and District Medical Center. I'd like to thank Jim Ward, the president of the Musher Committee, and all the volunteers and organizers who worked tirelessly through the 20th annual Mushers Rendezvous. The resounding success it was. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Indian Head, Milestone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on February 27th, I had the pleasure to attend the launch of the mental health capacity building pilot at Greenall High School in Balgony. Mr. Speaker, this pilot will promote positive mental health in children, youth, families, and all people in our communities who interact with children. The initiative is focused on prevention and mental health promotion, early identification and intervention, and ways to work with children to help them better manage their overall mental health. Mr. Speaker, along with Greenall, 5 other schools across Saskatchewan will also be involved in the initiative, serving as resource hubs, giving students across a wide range of health promotion material programs through collaborating both through schools and healthcare providers. The students at Greenall were very enthusiastic about this new initiative and were very welcome to the impact this project will have on the lives of their community. As a province, we need to pull together, Mr. Speaker, to support wellness in our children and youth from now and into the future. I want to thank the government for its investment in mental health in this particular program of $1.2 million in the 18-19 fiscal year for the mental health capacity building pilot sites, and look forward to seeing this program succeed and change lives. Mental health has affected almost every person in this province, and we must continue to do what we can as a government to ensure our youth
have the best possible resources at their hands. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All right, let's see if we can have a little more order than yesterday. Question period. I recognize the Deputy Opposition Leader.
Mr. Speaker, it's been just over a year since one Sask Party leadership hopeful became the Deputy Premier and the Minister of Education. And back then, there was some cautious optimism. After all, on the campaign trail, the minister promised a new relationship with teachers. He acknowledged that, quote, not a wheel turns in our provincial economy without education. And it was that Premier who said at the same time, I commit to balancing the budget, but not on the backs of students, our elderly, our sick, or our most vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, there is no balance if deep cuts to education are not fully restored, and there is no balance if per-student funding is still lower than it was 4 years ago. To the Minister and to that Premier, can we expect that this budget won't be balanced on the backs of our kids?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, it's been a year since I became the Minister of Education, Mr. Speaker, and over that period of time, Mr. Speaker, we've seen some significant commitments to public education. Our Premier has stood up, Mr. Speaker, to fulfill a $30 million additional commitment to fund public education, Mr. Speaker. And I spent the last year out talking to teachers. I've been out talking to trustees, and I've been talking to parents, Mr. Speaker. And I've been listening to them. And I know the member opposite says, well, he's not listening, Mr. Speaker. Well, yesterday, Mr. Speaker, we received over 130 pieces of correspondence, Mr. Speaker, from various teachers around the province, talking about some of the challenges that they have in their classrooms, Mr. Speaker, and we're listening to those. Mr. Speaker, I know she follows social media. I encourage teachers to correspond with my office, Mr. Speaker, and we're listening to what teachers have to say. The member opposite only has to wait 2 more weeks, Mr. Speaker, to see what kind of listening we have done and what commitments we're making to public education in the budget, Mr. Speaker. I encourage her, I know she's a patient woman, Mr. Speaker, I encourage her to exercise a little more patience and wait for 2 weeks, Mr. Speaker, to listen to what we have to say about supporting the children in our classrooms.
I recognize the Deputy Opposition Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A $30 million partial backfill is not what's needed in education, and pieces of correspondence are not proof that anyone is listening on that side. If the minister was in fact listening, he would be hearing the same stories that I am. As a result of the cuts, Mr. Speaker, students are learning in crowded classrooms. Much-needed mental health supports can only be offered every few weeks because options have simply been cut. And teachers are struggling to help those children new to the province thrive because there simply are not enough EAL teachers. Does the minister recognize that starving the education sector takes away supports from the kids who need it the most vulnerable that Premier talked about?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
I'm not sure how many times, Mr. Speaker, I have to stand on my feet to let the member know that we're listening, and I'm listening, to the teachers in this province, Mr. Speaker, to listening to the other educators, trustees, and parents, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, she only has to wait a short 2 weeks to hear what the outcome of those conversations have been. I have not shied away from meeting teachers in their classrooms, Mr. Speaker, meeting them in large groups, meeting with local representatives of the STF, Mr. Speaker. I've traveled around the province meeting with teachers, meeting with literally hundreds of them, Mr. Speaker. And I don't do that just to pay lip service to teachers. I do it because I'm genuinely interested in hearing what they have to say, because we know that at the front lines of education are teachers. They know what they need, Mr. Speaker, and I need to listen to that. And I have been doing that, Mr. Speaker. So in 2 short weeks, my good friend, the Minister of Finance, will stand on her feet, Mr. Speaker, and deliver our budget, Mr. Speaker, balanced budget. And I ask that the member opposite, just to have some patience, Mr. Speaker, to see what the outcome of those conversations have been and how much I've actually been listening to teachers.
I recognize the Deputy Opposition Leader.
Mr. Speaker, while I can be patient and wait, I'm afraid that our classrooms are done waiting and they need to see action. Mr. Speaker, we don't know anything different from today than we knew a year ago. Here are the facts. In our major centres, there are 23% more English as an additional language students than there were in 2014. Over the same time period, Mr. Speaker, the number of EAL teachers in the province has dropped by more than 7%. And despite significant growth in the number of kids with complex needs in our schools, there are currently fewer counsellors, fewer psychologists, fewer speech and language pathologists supporting those kids. Those are the facts, and we knew that a year ago. There's no way around it, Mr. Speaker. This government's cuts are hurting our kids and those who need it the most. And if funding is not restored, these kids will continue to fall through the cracks. Again, to the minister, will he unequivocally confirm that there will not be a status quo budget for education, as the finance minister has alluded, and will there be a significant boost to funding to get things back on track?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite knows how this works, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Finance will stand in her place in 2 weeks and deliver our balanced budget, Mr. Speaker. But I want to remember, Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the member opposite what has happened in terms of public education and funding over the term that we've been in government, Mr. Speaker. 33% increase in operating funding, Mr. Speaker, to school divisions across this province to benefit the children in the classrooms, Mr. Speaker. And that's over a 12.5% increase in enrollment, Mr. Speaker. A direct impact, Mr. Speaker, with respect to classrooms. And we've heard from teachers, Mr. Speaker, we've heard from other professionals in education about the challenges in the classroom. It's no secret, Mr. Speaker, that there's a new reality in classrooms. There's more complex needs, Mr. Speaker. Teachers want more support. Those are things that we hear, Mr. Speaker. And we're out having conversations about that, having conversations with my officials within the Ministry of Education to address those very needs, Mr. Speaker. It's not all about money. We know money is important, Mr. Speaker, to help support children in the classroom, but we're doing a lot of other work, Mr. Speaker, in education to support those very children, and I'm very proud of the work that my ministry is doing on that front.
I recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister for Central Services rolled into the rotunda and said some very interesting things about the new office building in Wascana Park. He said that the 4-story office building going up in our treasured park, quote, complies with the master plan, and that was done in 2016 by the old Wascana Centre Authority, end quote. But Mayor Michael Fougere, who was the chair of the authority at the time, told CTV yesterday, quote, the last meeting of the Wascana Centre Authority Board, which I chaired, we resolved to send this whole project back to the new Capital Commission for them to decide, end quote. So, will that minister get his facts straight, withdraw that comment, and finally accept full responsibility for giving away this important piece of Wascana Park?
Recognize the Minister of Central Services.
Thank you very much to the honourable member for her question. I don't know if I rolled into the rotunda. I maybe sauntered, briskly walked, strolled. Haven't been doing any running yet. Mr. Speaker, certainly I'm very pleased to clarify for the member opposite the information that she is requesting. It is contained on page 70 of the 2016 master plan, where indeed it says the Wascana, and I quote, the Wascana Centre Authority Board has recently confirmed that the Canadian National Institute for the Blind is a conforming use in Wascana Centre. This was done at a time when the government did not have a majority on the board table. Again, this wasn't, there's various stages of approval to the process. This particular quote pertains to the Wascana Centre Authority and the confirmation that it pertains to the master plan and the tenets and the principles of the master plan.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, that was markedly different than what the mayor had said last night. So my question again to the minister, who's correct, the minister or the mayor?
Recognize the Minister of Central Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'd ask the honourable member opposite to check page 70 of the master plan, the 2016 master plan, where it says the Wascana Centre Authority Board has recently confirmed that the Canadian National Institute for the Blind is a conforming use in the Wascana Centre.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, I'll leave that between him and the mayor to sort out, I guess. Yesterday, the Premier tried to downplay the sweetheart deal this Sask Party government struck with their biggest corporate donor. The Premier said, quote, "There's a lease with the Canadian National Institute for the Blind that was renewed," end quote. Mr. Speaker, it's more than a bit of a stretch to call that lease a simple renewal. The old lease banned subleases. The new lease leaves the door wide open for an assignment or a sublease to a third party, which is what we're seeing here. The old lease specifically limited the use of the property to helping the blind. The new lease opens the door to nearly any kind of business in the park. Does the Premier stand by that characterization of the 2016 lease, or will he admit that this so-called renewal is actually a dramatic overhaul?
Here, here. Recognize the Minister of Essential Services.
Thank you very much for the question. And certainly the lease that's in place today had its beginning in 1955 when Tommy Douglas first allowed the Canadian National Institute for the Blind to be located in the park. And I'm sure at that time, Premier Douglas at that time had his some controversy from the opposition at that time as well. But I think we have to agree that it has the Canadian National Institute for the Blind and the Wascana Center Authority, and their process and their placement in the park has been a good situation for all. And I'll quote from the CNIB statement. For more than 60 years, Wascana Park has provided an ideal place for CNIB to serve our Regina clients. Centrally located and transit adjacent, the park offers a safe environment for people with sight loss and to build their independence. Now there it is, Mr. Speaker, the information is there. And as far as the lease goes, I've had the opportunity in the House and I've had the opportunity to talk to the media. The Provincial Capital Commission Act supersedes all other information.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this morning, the federal government's Advisory Council on Pharmacare released its interim report. And although it's a small step in the right direction, we're still a long way off from the comprehensive pharmacare plan Saskatchewan people need. The report recommends creating a national drug agency and an evidence-based national formulary, but it falls short of calling for what Canadians really need: public, single-payer, universal prescription drug coverage for all. We know the status quo is unsustainable. The report notes that, quote, "Without reform, the system will soon be at the breaking point," end quote. Does the Health Minister agree with me that the federal government needs to go beyond half measures and actually deliver on universal pharmacare?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've said many times in this Assembly and in media scrums, that we certainly support the concept of a national pharmacare program, but the devil's in the details, Mr. Speaker. We need to see what this is going to look like. Mr. Speaker, I also saw the report this morning. I read it this morning. It's an 8-page interim report, Mr. Speaker. It's very broad. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, it was an attempt by the federal government to change the channel on federal politics, Mr. Speaker. We're going to wait for the final report and we'll evaluate it at that time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, this is our chance to advocate, and the 1 in 5 Saskatchewan households that cannot afford prescription medications expect that advocacy to be taking place right now. At the beginning of February, the federal government came under fire when reports came out that the federal pharmacare plan would be limited, something that would work to help big insurance and drug companies, but not everyday people. A few weeks later, the federal finance minister again lowered expectations, telling reporters that he would like to preserve parts of our patchwork drug coverage system rather than pursue a national program that ensures everyone is covered. Today's report presents the federal government with two choices: a fill-the-gaps approach or a single-payer model. Now, the federal budget is less than 2 weeks away. Will the minister join me in calling on the federal government to deliver what our country actually needs: public, single-payer pharmacare with universal prescription drug coverage for all?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I think much like the members opposite are doing with the provincial budget, they're doing the same with the federal budget now. They need to wait and see. Mr. Speaker, this report changed absolutely nothing. As I've said many times, we support the concept of a national pharmacare program. But, Mr. Speaker, we need to keep in mind that right now we have the best pharmacare program in the country. We have coverage for seniors, we have coverage for children, we have coverage for low-income people. Mr. Speaker, we want to see what the federal program looks like before we jump to any conclusions. Mr. Speaker, the NDP might want to help the federal Liberals jump the shark. This party is going to wait for the final report. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, I've read countless studies comparing drug coverage between provinces. I haven't seen a single one that supports this minister's claim about how we have the best coverage in Canada. So I'm not sure what book he's reading from.
Probably the Fraser Institute.
Mr. Speaker, last week we learned the auditor will be including vendor-sponsored travel as part of her annual audit on e-health. We welcome this investigation, Mr. Speaker, as we know that the Deputy Minister to the Premier's investigation only scratched the surface on issues plaguing this organization. And that report came after the Premier couldn't get his facts straight. It said little about contracts and whether the perks, like trips to the PGA, had any influence on the deals that were brokered. And that's the central question. The minister has claimed the external investigations found no problems with e-health contracts. If that's the case, then I'll urge the minister to show his work. Will the minister commit to releasing those reports today?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I was first advised of this situation with the vendor-sponsored travel, I think it was a little over a year ago, at that time, when I was advised, the board had already retained outside legal counsel. Mr. Speaker, subsequently, the advice they got from legal counsel was that this was a strong enough violation of code of ethics and policy that the employees in question were terminated, Mr. Speaker. They were dismissed from their position. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, the provincial auditor and e-health had been cooperating. They had many discussions. In fact, Mr. Speaker, just last week I spoke with the provincial auditor. I wanted to ensure her that she would have full cooperation to investigate wherever she deemed appropriate. She's assured me that she has full cooperation from e-health, Mr. Speaker. We look forward to her report and we intend on acting on the recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, the minister expects us to take him at his word that everything is fine, despite every indication suggesting otherwise.
Right.
The auditor wouldn't be taking on this extra work if it was.
Right.
Has the Sask Party government shared the 2 external investigation reports with the auditor and her team, who are digging into what's going on? And if so, details will emerge once her audit is made public. Will the minister do the right thing, shed some light on what has been going on, and release those reports today?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I was not assuring everyone that everything's fine. Inappropriate actions happen, Mr. Speaker. Employees did inappropriate things. They paid a big price for it, Mr. Speaker. They lost their jobs. Mr. Speaker, the point that I was making is that I believe the board took the right steps, including, Mr. Speaker, there's been consultation discussion between e-health and the provincial auditor. As I said, I spoke to her last week. She assured me she has full cooperation. I reaffirmed to her that I would like her to investigate wherever she feels appropriate, Mr. Speaker. She assured me she would. We look forward to her findings, Mr. Speaker, and we intend on acting on them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
A University of Saskatchewan study showed that 60% of refugee children and 42% of immigrant children have high or borderline cholesterol levels. And 36% of immigrant children and 23% of refugee children had an inadequate intake of zinc. These numbers are far above the national average and extremely high in comparison to Canadian-born children. More than half of newcomer children who resettle in our province don't have access to healthy food. How can that possibly happen in a province with as many resources as ours? The reality is that more and more people experience difficulties in meeting their nutritional needs, and this should simply not be the case. How can the Sask Party government say that their budget is balanced
when so many kids are going without the healthy food they need?
I recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And obviously, we've had an influx of newcomers to Saskatchewan and to Canada, and we want to welcome those newcomers here, Mr. Speaker. And we obviously understand that there's going to be some dietary adjustments. And I know that the Canada has put out the food guide and updated the food guide, as well as we have the First Nations and Inuit food guide as well, Mr. Speaker. And if we have to continue to work with our newcomers to be able to provide that, we would take some advice from Global Gathering and some of those other organizations who would be able to provide us with input if we need to be able to meet their needs. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Mr. Speaker, there are too many kids using the food bank in Saskatchewan. Almost half of the food bank users in the province are children, and this number is even higher in rural Saskatchewan. The rate of kids using the food bank in Saskatchewan is 10% higher than the national average, and the highest in the country. This is unacceptable. This speaks to the challenges families are having with putting food on the table. What's the Sask Party government's plan to address the high rates of food bank usage among children in our province?
I recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And any child in Saskatchewan that is having some trouble meeting their dietary needs, we want to be able to make sure that we're aware of that as social services so we can work with the family or the community-based organization or the community to be able to meet their needs. But, Mr. Speaker, as far as food bank usage, I had the honour of working at the food bank daily for 5 years, Mr. Speaker, working with the Saskatchewan Food Bank Networks and Food Banks Canada, Mr. Speaker. And I will also point out to the House that during the NDP's tenure, Mr. Speaker, the food bank usage in 2000 went from 12,000 people, Mr. Speaker, to over 25,000. It doubled under their tenure, Mr. Speaker. I can also report to the House, Mr. Speaker, that the percentage of people in low-income housing from 2006 has gone from 14.6% down to 9.5%. Mr. Speaker, more work to be done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I asked the GTH Minister some pretty direct questions about this government's divestment plan for the GTH, and he seemed to get a little hung up on language. Now, let me get this straight. From 2009 to 2019, they were trying to sell land at the GTH, and now they are divesting it. You just change the words and sales will take off? A brilliant marketing move, Mr. Speaker. This government has been struggling to sell land at the GTH since 2009. And how on God's green acre will a real estate firm on Bay Street be any better at it?
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, we're anxious to sell land at the GTH, and frankly, Mr. Speaker, I don't care whether we call it selling or divesting. Either way, it's good for the citizens of the province to have the land marketed, a new purchaser in there, whether they be sold or divested, it doesn't really matter. What we want to have is people out there that are using the property for commercial purposes, people that are employing people, people that are paying taxes, people that have got goods that are coming and going into our province, people that are using the facilities what they are supposed to be used for. Mr. Speaker, those are the type of things that we want to see going out there. I have no appetite to argue semantics with the member opposite. Those are her issues, not ours. Our issues are to do the right thing with the GTH. We want to do what is absolutely the best so that people can continue to get the maximum benefit of it, as they have with Loblaws, as they have with the other people that are using the property, and that's the direction that this government is going, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, that minister gets all grumpy when I ask questions about the GTH. You know what?
He does.
He reminds me of the old man in the corner a lot yelling, "Hey, you kids, get off my lawn." Well, maybe he should answer some of the questions and he wouldn't be so grumpy. The lack of transparency around the GTH has plagued this project since the beginning, and it's set to only get worse. So, Mr. Speaker, let's try another question. Why did you fire your CEO, Brian Richards, and go for the Bay Street Boys? And what was his severance worth to the people of Saskatchewan?
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite has been around for a long time. She's practiced law for a lot of years in the issue. She knows what a human resource issue is. She knows how those things work. She knows we don't talk about those kind of things. The questions that she's asking are something that may turn up in public accounts, but we're certainly not going to be discussing a personnel issue on the floor of the legislature. What we are going to do is talk about wanting to move goods in and out of the province. We want to talk about the jobs that are created in there. We want to talk about the people that are going to go to work every day. We want to talk about the 4,800 trucks every week that go in and out of the Loblaws facility. We want to talk about the 1,800 jobs that were there and how many more 100 jobs that will eventually come into that facility, Mr. Speaker. Those are the things that we should be talking about in this Assembly rather than that. And if the member opposite doesn't want me to be grouchy, let's keep talking about good news.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
Government orders, adjourned debates, item number 16. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 155, the Legislation Act. Ms. Sproul.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon and enter into the debate around Bill number 155, the Legislation Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill is repeals the Interpretation Act, the Regulations Act, and the Statutes and Regulations Revision Act is in fact a new piece of legislation. It updates the language used in the existing legislations and adds new definitions, sets out the procedures governing the enactment of laws, repeals and amendments of acts, interpretation of acts and regulations, appointment of public officers and persons who may act for minister, management and control of a corporation, and the revisions and consolidation of acts and regulations. It also introduced some consequential amendments pursuant to the changes of some previous legislations, and also includes a French version, which is, of course, as we know, very important, especially when we had the delegation in the chamber that we had today. Mr. Speaker, I have a few questions about this bill, mainly about why this legislation...
Order, please. In the middle of adjourned debates, let's give the opportunity to start one. Apparently there might be some committee work. Don't know. Might be interested in that, folks. Sort of business that we do here. Recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm so glad everyone is now going to pay attention to my extremely important discussion around, and a very exciting discussion around Bill number 155, the Legislation Act. Some of the questions I have around this legislation is, frankly, why this legislation was created in the first place. We've had the Interpretation Act for a while now in particular, and essentially it's being rolled into the legislation, or now we're having this new piece of legislation that's dealing with it. So I'm not sure if that's to get us in line with other jurisdictions, or why this was deemed necessary by the minds at the Ministry of Justice. But those are the sort of questions that I'm hoping I'm going to be able to have answered at committee. Some of this does seem like a housekeeping bill, but there are pieces of it that do warrant some important discussion and some answers from officials. So as such, I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to ask those questions at committee, so I am prepared to allow this bill at this time to move on to its next stages.
For the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 155 be now read a second time. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize Government House Leader.
I designate the Bill number 155, the Legislation Act, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourned debates, item number 17. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 156, the Legislation Act, Consequential Amendments 2018. Ms. Sproul.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise once again this afternoon and enter into the debate around Bill number 150, Consequential Amendments Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill is the companion legislation to the bill I was just speaking about, Bill number 155. It largely introduces some amendments to other acts that reference the repealed legislation that's in that the previous bill repeals and replaces that reference to the appropriate reference in the new, what will be the Legislation Act. So it's, like I said, it's largely a companion legislation. It's just making some consequential amendments to the other legislation, which is really the meat and potatoes of the changes. So at this point in time, I'm prepared to allow Bill number 156 to move on to its next stages.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the member and the minister that Bill number 156 be now read a second time. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize the Government House Leader.
I designate that Bill number 156, the Legislative Consequential Amendments Act 2018, be committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 24. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 163, the Legal Profession Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Vermette.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into discussion and debate with respect to Bill number 163, the Legal Profession Amendment Act 2018. Certainly, this is an important piece of legislation. I know our critic and will be and has been directly involved with stakeholders on this front, and we certainly invite the participation of stakeholders that are watching the progress of this bill at this point in time. It's critical that we make sure that this bill is as effective as it can be, Mr. Speaker, in responding to some of the gaps to access of the law that exists for many, Mr. Speaker. So this is an important piece of legislation. We would invite the participation of many to make sure that if there's an opportunity to strengthen this piece of legislation, that we will. It's critical that the Law Society and the Bar be involved in this process. It's certainly our hope that they've been fully engaged at every step of the development of this piece of legislation and in full consultation. I understand that this bill makes changes that reflect some of the practice of some of the states south of us, Mr. Speaker, and that it sets up the ability or the creation of limited licenses, although it's still to be determined what those licenses will be allowed to do. Certainly access to justice is incredibly important and a real challenge for many within our province. I know this is something that our critic, the member for Douglas Park, is a passionate advocate for, Mr. Speaker, speaking to the gaps that exist and working to close those gaps. And where possible in this, with this piece of legislation, I know she'll be engaged in ensuring access for many, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the cost of the legal process and of lawyers is simply out of reach for many, Mr. Speaker, and we need to do what we can to make sure that access to the law is there for many. There's questions that relate to how this will be regulated and monitored. Many questions that I know will be coming to committee by our critic. And again, I just thank all those that will have been involved in the creation of this legislation by way of the Law Society and the Bar and many other experts and stakeholders, Mr. Speaker. It's critical that they're engaged, and know as the official opposition, it's our aim to make sure that this legislation is as effective as it can be. So please be communicating any gaps or any improvements directly with our critic and with our team. With all that being said here today, Mr. Speaker, I'll adjourn debate for Bill number 163, the Legal Profession Amendment Act 2018.
The members move to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Debates. Item number 25. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 164, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2018, number 3. Ms. Mowat.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to join in on the debate on Bill 164, the Statutes Law Amendment Act 2018. Initially, the bill, I think, takes about 50 different pieces of legislation, acts, and is amending, and I guess it's wording, language, making sure the language clear. So it's mainly what I can see and what I was looking at and talking to my colleague, and just it's mainly language and housekeeping and cleaning up some things that will impact a lot of the different acts, and I think it refers to the GRF account and that type of wording to make sure they're using, I guess the wording that they're using when all the acts are familiar, and what wording that people are used to within the ministries, ministers, and just so it's not a huge change. It's mainly housekeeping, as I said. There's not a lot, like I said, it's 50 plus acts that are listed that will have minor changes to it. And like I said, it's very small, but they're housekeeping, and it's something that time to time, I imagine, has to be done to keep up with the language changes that we're using and terminology. So at that point, I really don't have a lot to say. I know my colleagues will have an opportunity in committee if they have further discussions on this bill. So at this point, I'm prepared to adjourn debate on Bill 164, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item number 26. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 165, the Workers' Compensation Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Rancourt.
I recognize the member for Regina Northeast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor again to participate in this debate today. What we're debating is the Workers' Compensation Amendment Act, and happy to see that one of the key pieces of that legislation is expanding the presumptive coverage for some of the conditions that firefighters are faced with. And Mr. Speaker, that's a very important advancement for our firefighters. Of course, as we know, our first responders put their lives at risk, not just in the immediate peril of dealing with potentially a fire or dangerous situation, but also in long-term accumulated exposure to hazardous chemicals that they might ingest either through breathing or through their skin. And so this is a very good thing for our first responders and our firefighters, Mr. Speaker. And it's building on the work of previous governments under Minister Deb Higgins, an NDP minister and a member from Moose Jaw Wakamo at the time. At one time, Saskatchewan had the best coverage for presumptive coverage for firefighters, and so this is building on that work. It's standing on the shoulders of the good work that the NDP government did at that time. Mr. Speaker, I noticed that one thing, it's rare that this government admits to making a mistake, but I do note that they note that there was a mistake made that is being fixed to make sure that benefits for dependent spouses are indexed. They noted that had been mistakenly removed the last time around, and that is now being corrected. And so, while it maybe falls short of an apology, it is an admission that once in a while this government does make a mistake and recognize it. Mr. Speaker, what is still needed in this important area, though, is a plan and a strategy to deal with the many workers, not just firefighters, not just first responders, but a plan to deal with the many workers in our province who face long-term degenerative injuries as a result of their work. It might be carpal tunnel, it might be back problems. There's many different injuries that people experience as a result of the work that they do. And workers' compensation is supposed to strike a balance. On one hand, it gives employees access to coverage without having to worry about suing their employer, without having to worry about whether they can pull together the proof to show that their employer was somehow to cause for their injury. And on the other hand of that balance is to protect employers from being sued. And so under that balance, employers are protected as well. And so we have this balance. But many workers, Mr. Speaker, continue to not get the coverage that they need under our workers' compensation system, and that needs to be addressed. It's not just firefighters. Of course, firefighters deserve our support, and so I'm happy to see that they are getting additional protection, but they're not the only workers, Mr. Speaker. There's workers who are exposed to asbestos. There's workers who are exposed to other dangers to their health and their lives in their workplace. And this government needs to do a better job of making sure that they, too, get coverage for their family security and their income under this legislation. So with that, Mr. Speaker, appreciate the opportunity and the honour to participate in this debate. I'm sure we'll have further questions in committee on this bill. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll move that we amend or that we adjourn debate on this bill.
Members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 12, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 145, the Residential Services Act 2018. Ms. Sproul.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, it's always an honor to enter into adjourned debates, and today I get the honor to put some of my remarks with regards to Bill number 145, the Residential Services Act, on the record. Mr. Speaker, this particular bill is of particular interest for myself as the critic for social services, so I will have an opportunity to have more discussion when we have committee and have an opportunity to speak with the minister and his officials with regards to some changes. We know that this is basically replacing an old bill that had basically the same name but wasn't reviewed since 1985, Mr. Speaker, and since 1985 there has been a lot changed, and so sometimes we forget to review some of this legislation, and so it's really important that this particular piece of legislation has some opportunity to be reviewed and updated to reflect the times. Because it's been such a long time since this particular bill has been brought forward, there has been a lot of revisions and provisions that have been removed from the previous bill. And so it's going to be a bit more convoluted when we discuss some of the changes, because there is quite a bit of change within these bills. So I'll have a lot of questions about what the past procedures were and some of the potential consequences of removing some of the provisions within the bill and the reasons behind that. And I know one of the things that have been brought forward is that there will be an increase in penalties for individuals who fail to abide by the regulations, and I have some questions with regards to that. The amount of people who potentially have had consequences, how often this becomes an issue and brought to the minister's attention, and what the appeal process will be for these care providers. Mr. Speaker, we know that in our province we rely on a lot of care facilities to take care of our most vulnerable
residents, and individuals need these care facilities. Sometimes it's an emergency placement, or it's maybe a long-term facility for care, and so it's very important that we ensure that these services are regulated and run appropriately. And one of the changes within this provision will be that they're moving, that they're going to be increasing the length of time for licenses to be issued from 1 year to 3 years. And they indicated this is to free up some of the public servants to have more time to dedicate to doing a review maybe more thoroughly, or having ability to do other aspects of their job. But what I am a bit concerned is why was it decided to move to a 3-year review from 1 year? That's quite a substantial amount of time from what the previous regulations were. And if this is going to be for all care facilities, or if there's going to be some provisions on who would be able to apply for the longer term, and what kind of assurance is going to be made that regulations are being followed within that substantial amount of time from a 1-year review to a 3-year. And but they also have, the minister, when he made his remarks, indicated that there could be an option to extend the licenses beyond the 3 years. And so I will definitely have a lot of questions on exactly what would be considered with making that type of provisions, and who would be making that decision. And I think it's really important that there is some level of proper procedure with regards to making that type of decisions, because we don't want a particular staff person or a particular care facility to be seen as being favored over others or whatnot. Again, the most important aspect is to ensure that there's safety, and I want to have a little bit of discussion with regards to what the steps government will be making to prevent and ensure that there's safety within these homes and preventing abuse. We know that there has been concerns in the past about abuse in some of these care facilities with regards to patients, and also with regards to abuse towards staff members. So how are they going to assure that there's appropriate staffing levels, there's appropriate care provisions for patients, and again, if there's not constant regulations or provisions for workers to be doing evaluations, with again moving to a lengthy time of licensing, hopefully that won't compromise the residents' care. And so that's something that needs to be looked into. Also, I do have some questions with regards to the list of care facilities within the province and the category of them, what type of facilities they are. When the minister made remarks, he talked about a variety of different ones for children who are in the care of the department, or the women who are trying to leave dangerous situations. So there's quite a variety of different facilities within our province, and so I would like to know where the public maybe can access a list of these care facilities, and is this made public, the care facilities that are under the provisions of the government. And so the minister also made some remarks with regards to expanding the residential options. Some of the with regards to expanding the definition of care facility will reduce unnecessary barriers. So some of that language, obviously we don't see that in the legislation. I just saw that in the remarks of the minister. So I will be asking what, again, he was making those remarks regarding, and if he could give me some examples of what that might be, and having that discussion. So, Mr. Speaker, I know that I have colleagues who also want to put their remarks with regards to this important piece of legislation on the record, and I will have many more questions when this comes to committee, and I'm looking forward to having those discussions with the minister.
So at this point, Mr. Speaker, I feel that I'm going to cease my remarks with regards to Bill number 145, and I'm going to adjourn debate. Thank you.
The members move to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Thank you. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 10, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 147, the Oil and Gas Conservation Amendment Act 2018. Mr. McCall.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To join in on Bill number 147, the Oil and Gas Conservation Amendment Act 2018. I guess initially looking at this bill and what it's doing, amendments that the Act's doing, it's changing some of the regulations and with the ministries, looking after the pipelines and looking after oil and gas. And I guess they're changing regulations. And I'm assuming, and I know we'll have to ask in committee, there's obviously reasons why legislation comes forward, whether it's individuals, industry, ministries make recommendations and make changes and feel that there's maybe regulations have to be changed. For different reasons, they'll bring forward amendments and changes. And in this bill, again, it brings in some of those changes. It's going to, I think, strengthen the regulations, what I can see from the information that's been provided. And I don't know, at the end of the day, we always ask, well, why was this brought forward? And like I said just a previous, that, you know, there's different reasons why regulations are strengthened, changed, and it is. So here's an opportunity to have regulations that will give, I guess, powers to the inspectors and to making sure our industry out there is doing the best to keep the public safe as best they can. And you know, as times go on, you find out there are situations where, for whatever reasons, through inspections or through complaints or industry saying maybe it needs to, you know, improve certain areas, if that dialogue goes on. I'm not sure who all they would have consulted with, you know, when they went through this, and if there's a groups that they identify, whether they talk with First Nations, the Métis, rural municipalities, urban municipalities as well. I'm not sure who all they talk with, but obviously I'm hoping they'll do the work that they need to do to, you know, industry, I guess those individuals who do inspections, do work on the oil and gas field and the good work that's being done. So having said that, I know that we'll have more you know, questions that we can ask, and this will be put under the regulations that comes in, that will be enforced. And it comes a little later, you'll get to see those as the minister and the ministry changes regulations, and for whatever reason. And at that time, we'll get a chance in committee to ask what type of regulations and changes will be coming forward, and get an opportunity to ask the minister and the officials what exactly does this look like, what will it do, and who will enforce it and all that. So it's going to give time, I know, at our critic, and time for members of the committee to ask more questions, and for both sides to even carry out a little further discussion with those that will be impacted by the changes to this legislation and amendments that they're making to the legislation. So at this time, I really don't have a lot further comments about this bill. So I'm prepared to adjourn debate on Bill 147, the Oil and Gas Conservation Amendment Act 2018.
The members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 11, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 148, the Pipelines Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Pedersen.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Speaker, it's my pleasure to enter into adjourned debates today on Bill number 148, the Pipelines Amendment Act. Certainly, off the top, I just want to recognize the importance of pipelines to the oil and gas industry and to our provincial economy. We know that changes in this area need to well consider the environmental impact, the impact on people as well as the impact on our economy. So those are the things that we keep in mind as guiding principles. It's also important to make sure that we have pipelines that are regulated and safe, and that we want to make sure that we are working with industry and folks in community as well. So that's some of the lens that we approach this legislation with. I understand that this bill is being presented with a package of other policy changes in response to the Husky oil spill. And I think that it's always important for us to keep in mind when we see bills that are developed in response to significant incidents in our province, and to make sure that there is full consultation, that it fully complies with any recommendations that would have come out of that report. So those are some of the questions that I have as I approach this as well. I understand that this is government's attempt to strengthen regulations on pipelines and flow lines in our province, and that the changes are supposed to be quite broad-based and address gaps that exist in our current legislative framework. When the minister was giving her second reading speech, she addressed a few of the key changes that are being proposed in this bill. The first of those is improving and expanding IRIS, which is the Integrated Resource Information System that's operated by the Ministry of Energy and Resources. Specifically, they're looking at expanding IRIS to include issuing and administration of licenses for pipelines and flow lines. In addition to that, so that's a legal online registry. In addition to that, there is a plan for the establishment of a legal mechanism for the minister to acquire historical flow line and pipeline surveys directly from Saskatchewan land surveyors. And I understand this is going to be an online system that is being developed to modernize the process and make sure that everyone is on the same page and the ministry can be diligent. And I also understand along with these changes, there is proposal for some what are being referred to as housekeeping amendments, just to align the regulation-making powers that are found in the Act with those of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. So that is what has been brought forward about the changes that are being proposed here. I think that there are a couple of things we need to take into consideration. The first is that we certainly understand the attempt that this legislation is making to reduce the amount of paper used for registration. It seems prudent to get everything into a system that can clearly be consulted for tracking information about licenses and allow the ministry to have access to that information. And then I also want to raise that a key portion of any time we're talking about pipeline creation and regulation, a key aspect here is consultation with First Nations and making sure that First Nations communities are properly consulted when it comes time to conduct a pipeline survey. So there are, and in the government's release from March 23rd, 2017, that announced the amendments to the pipeline regulations after the Husky oil spill, the minister at the time stated, we have consulted with industry on these actions, referring to such actions as the review of water crossings. And so there's a question here about whether the minister consulted also with the James Smith Cree Nation and Cumberland House Cree Nation that were affected by the oil spill. And these are examples of situations that are not fostering us moving forward toward real reconciliation. And I think that we need to keep that top of mind when we are doing our consultations. And I hope that the minister will have a look at these remarks and will take that into consideration. And failing that, I know that my colleagues and the critic will bring forward these concerns into committee, and we'll have further questions about how these changes came about and what the consultation looked like, to make sure that it is being done in the most prudent way. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will move to adjourn debate on Bill 148, the Pipelines Amendment Act 2018.
The members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 13, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 149, the Police Regional Policing Amendment Act 2018 is Mowat.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I enter in this afternoon to debate around Bill number 149, the Police Regional Policing Amendment Act 2018, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciated reviewing the words of the minister, the brief words on this front, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, it'll be important for us to pursue in committee some greater understandings with respect to this legislation. I want to just recognize the efforts of those that serve and protect every day in communities and parts of Saskatchewan all across our province, Mr. Speaker, facing very difficult conditions and dealing with those that are incredibly vulnerable at times, Mr. Speaker, and bringing about peace and safety and security for many, and in many cases without the resources that they need and deserve, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, our critic and our team will be and has been consulting with respect to this piece of legislation, making sure that we fully understand the needs of police all across our province and of communities, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, I know many people are concerned by the cutbacks of this government with respect to policing, Mr. Speaker. The consequences of that are real, and we need to have the supports in place, Mr. Speaker. But more than that, we've had police leaders and police services and leadership of police forces all across this province speaking for a long period of time with a very clear voice about the need to respond to mental health and addictions in a much better way in this province, Mr. Speaker. And very specifically, they were some of the very first voices calling for action around crystal meth in this province, Mr. Speaker, and a spike that they were witnessing in the use of crystal meth, Mr. Speaker, and I track back a number of years ago here, Mr. Speaker. These are leaders of our police forces who are speaking that truth directly to the leadership of this government, certainly to any of us that were prepared to listen, and making that important call about the need to coordinate action and resources and support to combat crystal meth within this province, Mr. Speaker. And I'd certainly suggest, Mr. Speaker, that there's just passing attention to this very important priority, something that should be a priority for this government, Mr. Speaker, and the costs and the consequences are real. When you hear police chiefs and leaders directly attributing the spike, the dangerous spike and high level of utilization of crystal meth and correlating that to crime and drugs and gangs within our province, Mr. Speaker, that should have been a call for action a long time ago. The consequences are now. We see the spike in crime in communities all across our province, but I witnessed those in Regina, Mr. Speaker, and property crime has become a real challenge. Other types of crime has become a real challenge, Mr. Speaker. The costs are paid for by people who go through damage, whose sense of safety gets compromised, Mr. Speaker, and this is something that this government failed to respond to. We have limited and actually cut back supports around anti-gang strategies within our province, Mr. Speaker, at the same very time where we've seen a spike in the kinds of activity that are directly connected with gangs, Mr. Speaker. This crystal meth crisis has to become a top-of-desk priority, has to become a real priority for the government because the consequences are real. And certainly it goes well beyond the lack of safety that many feel when crime is on the rise or the damage that's caused to property, Mr. Speaker. We also have many people that are caught up, not having the supports they need and deserve when it comes to addictions and mental health within the province, Mr. Speaker. So this piece of legislation here today, certainly we are critical. We'll continue to engage with policing leaders and municipalities and communities across the province. We all will, Mr. Speaker, and make sure we fully understand what's being brought about. But certainly there's concern across the province when it comes to inadequate resources for policing itself, Mr. Speaker. But more than that, the failure to address the crystal meth crisis in our province and the failure to respond and fix our broken mental health and addictions services within our province, Mr. Speaker. At this point in time, I will adjourn debate for Bill number 149, the Regional Policing Amendment Act 2018.
The members move to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 14, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill 150, the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Sarr.
Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Skip road with that second. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Good to join debate this afternoon on Bill number 150, the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2018. Again, Mr. Speaker, following, it's good to follow on the heels of my colleague, the member from Regina Rosemont, in terms of this particular piece of legislation, because while we've got some measures here that expand on previous good work that's been done under seizure of criminal or property used in the pursuit of crime or under the Safer Communities and Neighborhoods Act, there are some things that are sailing past us, Mr. Speaker, in terms of what's got underway with the rise again of crystal meth, the inadequate responses to date in terms of mental health in this province, and the way that those kind of things interact to prompt the growth of gangs, the way that preys on poor neighborhoods, Mr. Speaker, the way that preys on young people, and the terrible costs that get exacted in a lot of terrible ways across the province in terms of if you're not keeping track of these things, if you're not fighting them back, they tend to flourish and do some terrible things to people's lives. So while something like the expanding on the Seizure of Criminal Property Act with an amendment, in and of itself, fine thing, Mr. Speaker. In terms of reading the minister's second reading speech, the Minister for Corrections and Policing, in terms of the expansions that are made under this legislation, I'll look forward to the hearing at the committee in terms of the specific measures contained herein, how that is going to fix gaps that have been identified, or whether it's about having something to say as opposed to something to do in the face of what is too many ways a growing crisis in this province, Mr. Speaker. So for the measures under the Act itself, expanding the different forfeiture grounds. Again, Mr. Speaker, this is something that I have a lot of interest in and a lot of support for, but I don't know that this is. They're not doubling down on something that doesn't really need the attention, while fighting poverty, fighting substandard housing, fighting the conditions that promote hopelessness and despair and dislocation, Mr. Speaker, and that the way that in turn plays itself out in drug addiction and mental health problems. Again, Mr. Speaker, I don't know that, what are some, on their own good measures on the one hand, are equal to the task that is being faced in this province by far too many that are looking to the government for help, that are looking to the government for partnership, for leadership, for bringing the power of government to bear in terms of taking these things on, Mr. Speaker. So, again, while civil forfeitures is the fair ball, and I'm glad to see it's part of the front of initiatives, it's not the whole of the front. And if you're not covering the front, Mr. Speaker, then you're going to be losing ground, sure as shooting. So, Mr. Speaker, this is I guess, it does bring to mind, Mr. Speaker, the sort of epidemic growth that we are experiencing in this province in gun crime. And the way that, 10 years ago, I had neighbors that would have heard a bang in the night, and their first thought wouldn't have been, shots fired over on 1300 block Garnet. But that's the thought these days, Mr. Speaker. And you don't need to take it from me. You need look no further than statements on the record from the Police Commission in the City of Regina, or from the great work that is being done by the Regina Police Service and people like Chief Evan Bray, Mr. Speaker. So, again, there's a growing problem that is not addressed by piecemeal measures like this, that, again, in and of themselves are a good thing, but if you're not covering the front, Mr. Speaker, if you're not, not being smart on the causes of crime, as opposed to just crime, you're going to chase your tail around and around, Mr. Speaker. And the people will be poorly served by that. So, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to getting that more precise rendering of what is particularly entailed in this piece of legislation and the grounds therefore. And I know that the Speaker, not to involve the Speaker in debate, I know that the Speaker follows these issues with great interest as well. So I'm sure he's going to be looking for that broader explanation when this comes to committee. But, Mr. Speaker, for the meantime, I believe we've come to the point in the proceedings where it's fair enough to adjourn debate on Bill number 150, the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2018.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 15, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 152, the Builders Lien Prompt Payment Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Beck.
To recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To join on Bill number 152, the Builders Lien Prompt Payment Amendment Act 2018. Initially, I guess there have been concerns raised, and I know, I think even in the leadership races, there was concerns raised to different MLAs, individuals that I could understand that raised concerns about legislation like this, and if I don't have my facts straight, having said that, there was a push to deal with prompt payment, is my understanding, and this is why we have the legislation here today. It's because of the tradespeople, those professionals that do the good work in the building of projects in Saskatchewan, and you have landowners who actually hire the tradespeople, hire the professionals who do the building and construction of homes and different things. But having said that, I guess obviously why we're looking at this legislation and it's got forward is there's been concerns obviously about the prompt payment of the services they provide. So I don't have all the details. I'm not sure who all government would have talked with. I know some of our colleagues have talked to some of the tradespeople and have raised concerns about prompt payment. Yeah, sometimes we'll have to go through the process, and I know we will go through that process. But I think what it is, and my understanding, if I get this right, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is, if you building a building, and if it could take 6 months, I guess, to build a building and longer. How do you, as a small business or a small trades company you're operating, you have a few staff and you're trying to work on these buildings and contracts, whether it's housing or whatever it is, you have limited, I guess, resources, and when you utilize your resources, you hope to get payment. So what I'm understanding is that you put your invoice into the company that you're working for, the landowner, and you expect to get a prompt payment. If it isn't, they're now proposing some tools that a company, a small company, or whoever submits a bill, you have an opportunity, to actually go to that organization, which will be appointed by the ministry, and there'll be that tool to use to say, well, they will have the training to look at adjudicators to deal with your concern if there is one. So if there is an opportunity where you submit your bill, and this is, I have to understand that from my point, you submit your bill, you get prompt payment, you hope. If not, then there is a provision now in the Act that says how many days. I think it's 28 days they have after the initial bill's been put in to get prompt payment. So there's that opportunity. There is a tool for you to use and to put in a complaint and ask adjudicator to look at your situation. I know it would have to be a balance, it always is, because would think you want to continue working, so there has to be that balance, and maybe some companies do have that balance where they work well and they can talk and they can deal with the issues that come up. I guess this, from my understanding, Mr. Speaker, is going to give an opportunity for companies who need the assistance of adjudicator or a committee, a board that's set up with rules and regulations to give them the support they need to get the payments that they need. Now, I don't know if this is going to be also when it comes to government too, and I'm curious on this at the end of the day. If you do a service, and some people do work for the province of Saskatchewan, so is that coming into, will this take into that, or is it strictly in one area? Are they looking at other areas? I don't know, and I know we'll ask them questions about that, because prompt payment, obviously, from anybody, you put in an invoice, you're hoping, is it going to take 28 days, 30 days, 60 days? You hope not 90 days to get your payment. Should it be a ministry, a department, government? So I'm not sure, if they're looking at that as well. If not, I guess we'll hear concerns about it if that is, and maybe there isn't a concern, and that's not where they're going. It's strictly talking about the building, construction trades, and that industry. So at this point, I'm not sure. I know we'll have more questions, and we'll have an opportunity in committee, our critics will, to ask exactly where this come from, what type of information will be needed, and what type of regulations and what type of, tools will the adjudicator have to say to a company, a bigger company or a landowner, whoever it is working, you have to make that payment. Like you had 28 days, you didn't, you have to. I'm curious to see, and we'll see through the regulations, how that will play out. Is it, the landowner, is it going to be, so there are going to be some interesting times, I would think. But we'll see how this all works out, Mr. Speaker, in committee as we ask some questions of the ministry, the officials who are drafting the legislation to come forward, and the reasons why, and who did they consult with. Like I said, And who will this, who will this impact? And is this widespread? Did they hear a lot of concern, or is it, a small number or a large number? We could ask that and get clarification from the minister and their officials. So at this point, I have no further comments on Bill 150, the Building Lien Prompt Payment Amendment Act 2018. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 19, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 157, the Education Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Vermette.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise today to enter into the debate on Bill number 157, an act to amend the Education Act. And I was just downstairs talking with the kids from Caswell, and that was a real treat. My old school where I taught for a few years and talked about the kids in the school and what's important, what kind of important work are we doing up here? I said, well, we're going to be debating educational issues right away. And they appreciated the questions that were asked in question period because they feel this is their number one thing. This is what they see their connection to the province. And the issue for them, of course, is making sure they get a fair shake at the future. And it's a pretty competitive world out there, not only in terms of skills, but in terms of your health. As a young person, are you going to be able to deal with the challenges that are out there? Are you going to deal, as we've talked about, the whole issue around youth crime yesterday, the challenges of that? They're very aware of that in my neighborhood, Mr. Speaker. So education is a big thing that they look to for hope and optimism, and they have a sense of that trust. I mean, many of them will, well, in fact, I understand there were some grade 7s in the crowd, it's like picking out crows and ravens, which ones are the crows and which ones are the ravens. And so some were grade 7, so they were quite happy to be identified as grade 8s. They love to tag along, and so but they pointed that out to me downstairs, just to be clear, some of them weren't going to high school next year and shouldn't be held responsible for any actions that might happen in the high schools of Saskatoon. That would be some of their friends. But at any rate, we have some of the best high schools, I think, in the province. Bedford Road, Mount Royal, E.D. Fian are great schools in my riding, and they've lived up to the challenges in education. And so this is important. And so I do treasure the opportunity to talk on their behalf. Now, on one hand, this bill is talks about the terminology and correcting it both in English and French versions. Talks about exempting the city of Lloydminster from paying proceeds of school taxes that are received to the government, as the city of Lloydminster pays to the Board of Education there directly. And of course, we have a former chair of that board, so she would know of that firsthand. And I don't know if that's where this really stems from. She would really know this well. It also talks about the changing the clause on the acquisition of personal property, but by a board to clarify who has the authority to manage their own personal property. Which is of interest, Mr. Speaker, I think, of many school boards as they acquire gifts. And of course, land values do increase. But interestingly, many schools, and I think of Nutana, has an incredible art collection. In fact, if you look through the school board policy manuals, you'll find policies are maybe a page, half a page long. Some might be 2 pages. But the school board policy on managing their visual arts, their painting collection, is several pages long, 10 or 20 pages long. It's very complicated because they've been very fortunate in the 40s and 50s to acquire some incredible artwork that now the values are quite something. So, Mr. Speaker, if you ever happen to be in Nutana Collegiate, do stop by and take a look at their artwork. It's really something. And I do want to raise that every time, you know, and you may not know this, I'm on leave from the public school board, so I take every opportunity to, have very long leave. But once a year I have to talk about the good things they do and everything school back in Saskatoon. But that is just some of the things that I know that are odd in schools because they've been given gifts, and some of these gifts acquire a lot of value over the course of the years. So, and then there was some work around the minister was talking about notifications of suspension of severance or severance of a teacher to the Saskatchewan Professional Teachers Regulatory Board, and that the language wasn't lining up, and so this again can be deemed as a bit of a housekeeping. We've not heard issues a lot on this, but we're going to take a look at it, and we've had some feedback over the time, and this will come into up when our critic brings this forward to committee, and we'll have a lot of conversations about this, and also just generally about how things are going. You know, we are very curious about the 136 letters the minister has received on his desk, and what kind of things the teachers are saying, and whether he's got it right, whether his note-taking. You know, it is interesting because we've asked about this before, particularly around some of the legislative secretaries who've traveled the province for a year but did not produce one item in writing of what their conversations were. It apparently was all in their heads, and they came back and relayed it, and that's all they needed to do. Some people may say that's really good memory. Some people say that would question that there's no record of conversations held. And for a minister, we'd be curious to know, were there notes taken at some of these, or were they just informal just gatherings that really no notes were taken, and that really didn't matter because there was going to be no action taken, and that was the full intent all along. So, Mr. Speaker, we'll be looking to see what kind of priorities come out in the budget in the couple of weeks. I know people are anxious, and they say, and it's a trite old saying, it's only 2 weeks, or it's going to be now 12 days, and then it's going to be 10. It's good that we know they can count backwards, but can they count forward is the question. Can they add? Can they do sums? That's a very important thing. It's always, this is something that we're going to be watching for and asking, because, you know, this government will be held accountable for one of the most important areas that they are held responsible for, and that's education. And that was just underlined to me again today with the students from Caswell, how critically important this all is. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I know that we've got lots of work to cover today, and I'm going to now move adjournment of Bill number 157, an act to amend the Education Act. I do so move. Thank you.
The members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 18, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 158, the Youth Justice Administration Act 2018. Mr. Forbes.
Recognize the opposition House Leader. Deputy Leader, no, the member for Regina Lakeview, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is my pleasure to rise this afternoon and enter into debate on Bill number 158, the Youth Justice Administration Act today. I think off the top, I just want to acknowledge, Mr. Speaker, that you and I have some history with youth justice in this province. In fact, I'm not an expert in this area by any means, but I did work with young offenders in the province back in the late 90s into the early 2000s. And I know that a lot has changed since then, and unfortunately I think that life has gotten more difficult for kids out there in many communities in our province, and the problems as difficult and sometimes unsurmountable as they seemed back in the late 90s and early 2000s, I'm afraid that that's just arisen with things like the introduction of more and more gang violence, things like crystal meth, and a further deterioration of communities as we move through generation after generation of trauma in many communities. I know that when I started working with youth in care, often my co-workers who I had worked with, who had been there for a number of years, decades, were seeing children of those who they had worked with as children. And as we move further through, we're seeing second, third, fourth generation youth through facilities. And Mr. Speaker, we're here today to talk about the Youth Justice Administration Act, which you know, is something that's going to deal with youth once they end up in care. I know that the critic has some concerns about some of the provisions in this specific bill, specifically around Section 5, seclusion, the use of seclusion for youth in custody. I think there's a lot of evidence about the damage that seclusion does, particularly to kids who have already experienced trauma, kids who have mental health issues. Let's put it plainly, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't help those things. The other section I think that is particularly concerning is around searches, both of youth as well as visitors and of staff within facilities. I think there'll be a number of questions there. But I think that the larger question here that I want to talk about today is a question of what is the most effective means of reducing the number of youth going into youth justice facilities in the first place. And Mr. Speaker, I can say without being an expert that I don't think we've got that right. And I just want to quote one. I know members on this side have quoted the statistics, as has the child advocate in this province, but it bears repeating because it can't stand. It simply can't. According to a recent report from Statistics Canada, 92% of male youths and 98% of female youths admitted to custody in Saskatchewan are Indigenous. The highest rate in Canada, although these same youth represent only 8% of the youth population nationwide. Mr. Speaker, if we're worrying about the best way to put kids in seclusion rooms and the best way to search them, I think we're asking the wrong questions. We can tinker around. I understand the need for safety. I understand the need to cut off supply of contraband into youth facilities. I understand concerns about the safety of other youth and workers in those facilities. What I don't understand is how we, in 2019, in this province, can let statistics like that stand without asking more meaningful questions about how do we turn this around. And it's not that there isn't anecdotal evidence. There haven't been instances in this province of programs that have been effective, no matter how small the sample size. I think of the Street Culture Project, Mr. Speaker. I think of projects that take place in communities right around this province that have done a meaningful job with helping kids turn their lives around, helping families.
Kim Sutherland.
Strengthening Kim Sutherland, absolutely. My colleague here is right in pointing out the good work of Kim, Daryl, and others, yourself, Mr. Speaker. But those projects have been too small and far between to be effective. And here we are again in 2019 with some facilities. The Children's Advocate made mention of this being in 100% Indigenous youth incarcerated at times. So I think that this bill, the critic will have important questions about it, but I think that this bears talking about when we're entering into this discussion. I'm going to read something from a report, policy brief back in 2008, but I think the findings still stand. This is out of Princeton and the Future of Children report. It's called Keeping Adolescents Out of Prison. Authors Lawrence Steinberg and Ron Haskins. Both widely accepted legal principles and research on adolescent immaturity argue that juveniles are less responsible for their criminal behavior than adults and should therefore receive less severe punishment. Research shows that harsh punishment in adult facilities increases the probability of future violent crimes and that most youngsters who commit criminal offenses will abandon illegal behavior as they enter adulthood, all things being equal. I know from speaking with both community workers as well as youth in custody themselves, sometimes they come in on a breach or a small charge and they leave learning to be a much more violent offender, Mr. Speaker, so we have to weigh that. Scientific evaluations of the prevention and treatment for youth that provide systematic treatment in the community and family settings show that in these programs, those in the community and family setting, show significantly reduce future criminal behavior without the need for harsh sanctions. Mr. Speaker, we know what's effective. For whatever reason, we choose not to invest in those solutions. The conclusion of the brief states, and again, this is in the States, but I think it applies in Canada as well, should adapt their laws on juvenile crime to emphasize evidence-based treatment and to avoid harsh punishment for all but the worst violent offenders. Mr. Speaker, that's what the evidence tells us. We know what we're doing currently isn't working. And I think that these questions were rightfully raised by the child advocate. I know that members on this side will continue to raise those questions in the context of second readings on this bill, but also as a larger conversation in this province about where we currently are and where we want to go. But with that, I'm going to leave the comments in committee in the capable hands of my colleague. Thank you for listening, and I think it was important to get that on the record. And with that, I will move to adjourn debate on Bill number 158.
Here. The members move to adjourn. The members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 20, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 159, the Securities Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Pedersen.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter in this afternoon as it relates to Bill number 159, the Securities Amendment Act 2018. This is a fairly technical piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, and speaks to very important consultations that are a must with those involved in regulating our securities industry within our province and nationally. It also speaks to global changes, Mr. Speaker, the changes that have come about in Europe, Mr. Speaker, where regulators are requiring the registration with solid evidence of benchmarks for securities and for derivatives, Mr. Speaker. And of course, that's an important area that this legislation sets out to address in part. But it's critical that we get this right, Mr. Speaker, to ensure integrity of our securities and this sector, Mr. Speaker, securities and derivatives, Mr. Speaker. If a benchmark can, potentially be set arbitrarily by a security or a derivative administrator or those involved in the the specific entity, Mr. Speaker, there's the potential for manipulation or for misleading information, Mr. Speaker, that can come at the great expense of the public or an investor or Mr. Speaker. So it's critical that we have integrity and trust within our system, Mr. Speaker. This pertains as well to, of course, debt and equity investments, Mr. Speaker. Certainly we see far too often examples where someone's been exploited, Mr. Speaker, or a security has improperly stated information or marketed themselves, Mr. Speaker. And of course it's often the investor and often hardworking people that are doing all they can to put a little bit away for the future who are left in the lurch at that point, Mr. Speaker. And they're left to feel the pain and that are left with the loss, Mr. Speaker. Certainly in this case, it's important that the national body, the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada, or IROC, that they be fully engaged in this process. I've met with them in the past. I invite their participation right now to make sure that the legislation we're bringing forward, which is very technical legislation, that it meets the needs of ensuring the confidence and trust and integrity that people and investors deserve within securities here in Saskatchewan, of course, across Canada. They also play a very important role in ensuring accountability within that system. And this legislation, I understand, goes a distance to make sure that it respects the very important role of IROC in this entire system. But we certainly want to ascertain from them whether or not this piece of legislation is sufficient, or if there's aspects that were missed here, or if there's unintended consequences that weren't thought out by this government, and ultimately if there's opportunities to improve this important piece of legislation to ensure integrity of that of a system that is important for markets to be able to trust in, and that investors can trust in. Certainly here in the province, the FCAA, the Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority of Saskatchewan, plays an instrumental role in ensuring the integrity of securities within this province, and making sure that that's coordinated with wherever possible with our jurisdictional partners and provinces across Canada, and there's a cooperative effort that's currently taking place to build out some national standards on that front. But ultimately we need to make sure that this legislation and this government are looking out for the interests of Saskatchewan people and Saskatchewan investors and Saskatchewan markets, Mr. Speaker. And all of these changes, and a lot of the changes, as I say, around benchmarks are due to changes that are occurring in Europe that are aimed and designed to ensure greater integrity of securities, the system as a whole, the markets, Mr. Speaker. But we need to make sure that these changes are practical and don't have unintended consequences for Saskatchewan people, Saskatchewan investors, Saskatchewan for Canadian markets. Mr. Speaker, certainly ensuring that we're compliant with regulatory systems in Europe also is important for any security or derivative that's involved in activity with Europe as well. And so certainly that's an very important consideration within all of this work, Mr. Speaker. There's other changes that have been brought forward here today, but I think I'll leave a lot of that for the committee process. We'll continue to speak to it in this assembly as well. But again, I would invite input, feedback, certainly from IROC, anyone else that's involved in the regulatory system around securities and derivatives, Mr. Speaker, anyone that's involved in the investment world that has input on this, anyone who has input and advice around consumer protection and investor protection, Mr. Speaker, because it's very important that we lead in Saskatchewan with legislation that serves people and investors and markets across Canada and ensures trust and confidence and integrity for all involved. With that being said, Mr. Speaker, I will adjourn debate with respect to Bill number 159, the Securities Amendment Act 2018.
The member from Regina Rosemount has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 159. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 21, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 160, the Trespass to Property Amendment Act 2018. Ms. Moen.
I recognize the member from Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in my place today to give responses to Bill 160, the Trespass to Property Amendment Act 2018. And Mr. Speaker, there's a number of things that I'd like to share with the Assembly as it pertains to this particular bill. At the outset, Mr. Speaker, I want to point out that I'm very proud of my father's history as a World War II veteran that served this country during the World War II to give us the basic freedom that we enjoy today as a society and certainly as a country. We see continued service over the years of people that have really stepped up to the plate to provide democracy in our province and democracy throughout our country. And that is very apparent today as the many people that continue to serve our country provide this protection and the democracy that we enjoy. It's on that note, Mr. Speaker, that it's attached and connected to the bill that we're speaking about today. What's really important, Mr. Speaker, is I say the perspective of my father's service from the Indigenous community perspective. My grandfather worked for the Hudson Bay Company and he was French origin that immigrated from St. Boniface, traveled from St. Boniface into the Alacross area where he met Beatrice Morris, who was, of course, my Indigenous grandmother. And they, of course, had children, to which one of them was my father. And as a Métis person, Mr. Speaker, my father enlisted in the Army and joined the fight for Canada and went off to a World War, half the world away, at a very young age of 17 years of age from Île-à-la-Crosse. Many people from our area and many people from the First Nations community and Métis communities did the same thing throughout our province of Saskatchewan. They served the country, they went and protected the country, half a world away at that young age because they were Canadians, Mr. Speaker. They're proud of Canada, they were certainly proud to be part of that service. Now what does this all mean? What does it all have to do with the Trespass Act, Mr. Speaker? It talks about inclusion, it talks about sacrifice, it talks about service to the country. And many people of many origins, Mr. Speaker, served this great country over time. And I'm proud to say that the Indigenous people of Saskatchewan served as well. And many of them served with great distinction and great recognition over time. So, Mr. Speaker, when I see bills that I think are an affront to democracy overall, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that we point out as legislators that the fact of the matter is that there are certain bills that ought to be pointed out that really do a disservice to our province and our country overall, not recognizing the basic principle that everyone and every person in this province has contributed to the strength of Saskatchewan overall, and not only from the historical perspective, Mr. Speaker, but from the perspective of today. Now what really pains me, Mr. Speaker, on Bill 160, the Trespass Property Amendment Act, that what is being proposed by the Minister of Justice, Mr. Speaker, which I think is really not something that I'm proud to say as a legislator that I see coming forward from the Minister of Justice, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because it is not proper for him to propose a bill, I think overall, that creates many more divisions in our province then builds on the strength and the opportunity we all offer as people of Saskatchewan. I point out to my father's Indigenous background, Mr. Speaker, as a service to this country. And he didn't go serve because he was Indigenous, he went to serve because he was Canadian. And what we want to do is to recognize that absolutely everybody should be included in the future of the province of Saskatchewan, because isn't that our motto? For many people, strength. Isn't that our motto, Mr. Speaker? So when we see a great injustice being done for pure political gain, Mr. Speaker, it's important that we stand up to recognize that injustice and point it out wherever we're at. And we've had champions over the years that have pointed out the injustice in our Canadian parliamentary system and Saskatchewan's history as well, Mr. Speaker. And why is this unjust, Mr. Speaker? It is unjust because it is purely politically motivated, Mr. Speaker. It does not take into account the incredible opportunity that people should have in talking about bills like the Trespass of Property Amendment Act being proposed of all people, Mr. Speaker, of all people, the Minister of Justice. And I say today, Mr. Speaker, that is a shame. Now, I'm going to go back to my father's service when they talked about how proud he was to go half the world away to serve his country, to protect democracy, and to promote participation of all people, including the Indigenous people. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I've said at the outset, there are certain injustices that we have to correct, that we have to stand up and be counted. And I've struggled with this bill since it is being introduced, and I think it's important for people to know why, the people of Saskatchewan. Now, no one on this side of the Assembly, and my father included, and myself included, like the opportunity to or defend the horrific challenges attached to crime, Mr. Speaker. Nobody likes having their property broken into. Nobody likes having assets stolen and their home affronted. Nobody likes that. My father hated that kind of activity. I hate that activity. A lot of people in our Indigenous community don't like that activity, Mr. Speaker. They don't like it one bit. And that's the same premise that many people, many of our rural families struggle with when they have their property stolen, or they have their homes ransacked, or they have their property generally disrespected in any way, shape, or form. Not one person in this province, not one person in this assembly, not one person on this side of the House like that activity. In fact, we downright hate that activity. And we look at the challenges that many rural people have, Mr. Speaker, and we respect the fact that they have a right to have a safe home, they have the right to be able to build up their assets and to strengthen themselves to become independent people. Everyone on this side of the Assembly respects that, Mr. Speaker. But the challenge we have when you have bills of this sort, it drives a wedge, a division amongst our people, which is not proper and not fair. The Minister of Justice can stand in his place all he wants, and he can say this is about security of property. Mr. Speaker, in the Assembly, and certainly from my perspective, I point out that it is meant to drive a wedge in Saskatchewan, the Saskatchewan political landscape. And I say that is not fair, especially, and it's not proper, especially coming from the Minister of Justice. Now, I go back to my earlier comment, Mr. Speaker. Just to recap, so there's no quoting from me or improperly quoting from my perspective. Number one is we're proud of all the service of our people that have given us democracy in this country. Number two is we do not like the effects of crime on any family, rural, Indigenous, or city families. Nobody likes that activity, period, Mr. Speaker. Number three, security of our community is important for all reasons, Mr. Speaker, and that is something that we also want to reiterate. But the most important thing, Mr. Speaker, is we should be visionary, responsible, and effective if we want to be government, to ensure that we address those principles in the approach we have on dealing with this matter. And that's why Bill 160, Mr. Speaker, should never have been proposed by the Minister of Justice, because it does a great disservice to those principles that I've spoken about on this address, Mr. Speaker. It does a great disservice. Now, as I pointed out, Mr. Speaker, we are all for initiatives to reduce rural crime. We're all for initiatives to reduce property crime in our cities. We're all for initiatives that will reduce Indigenous or crime to our Indigenous communities, because many Indigenous families are hurt by crime, as the non-Indigenous people are as well. Who likes crime in the province of Saskatchewan? Absolutely no one. No one likes that happening to their backyard or to their homes or to their family. So what do we do about it? How do we respond to it, Mr. Speaker? We do not take a very singular focus, such as this particular bill does, to try and impress people that we're doing something about it, when in fact, Mr. Speaker, it is rife with challenges from the legal perspective and certainly from the effectiveness perspective as well, Mr. Speaker. And that's why the Minister of Justice should not have proposed this bill. There's a number of approaches that he should have taken that would have given us a better perspective on how to handle this challenge without dividing the people of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. And this is an injustice to the effort that is required to reduce crime and engage everyone in that effort, including the Indigenous people, the rural people, and the people of the cities, Mr. Speaker. Now, how does this work, Mr. Speaker? How does this work? On the matter of consultation with the First Nations people, Mr. Speaker, this minister and this government chose not to consult. They chose not to consult, Mr. Speaker. There's no consultation with the Métis Nation. There's no consultation with the First Nations, the people that have some incredible abilities. These governing bodies, the Métis Nation and the First Nations of our province, have incredible ability to come and be part of the solution. They were not consulted in any way, shape, or form, Mr. Speaker. In fact, if you look at some of the headlines in the newspaper, where it says, quite frankly, that Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations say that the provinces did not consult. The province did not consult on this. And for the Minister of Justice to break that fundamental principle of engaging everyone on the whole process of how we make sure we're doing the right effective, dealing with the right effective matters, Mr. Speaker, is consultation should happen. So that was the first mistake that the Minister of Justice made overall. The second mistake that he made, Mr. Speaker, is we have to bring the people together. We have to recognize we can all be part of the solution. So was there any consultation with the RCMP? Was there any consultation with the city police? Was there any consultation with the enforcement agencies of the province on how we can make this a more effectively patrolled and secure province overall, Mr. Speaker? How are the consultations there, Mr. Speaker? And the third thing is addressing the root causes of some of the crime that is being suffered by our rural families and our Indigenous families and our city families. Everyone is impacted and affected by the crime. So how do we reduce the root causes of those crimes, Mr. Speaker? Well, we look at the challenges around low income, families that are struggling to meet the everyday needs of shelter, warmth, and nutrition. Families are struggling throughout the province, and all we hear from the Minister of Social Services today is stats. Stats that you can make up in the back of a napkin to try and appear that they're dealing with the issue when in fact they're not. Where's the comprehensive strategy on addressing the opioid crisis, Mr. Speaker? Where's the strategy around protecting our kids and educating our families on how we stop the notion of drugs entering our community? None of that work occurred, Mr. Speaker. None of that work occurred. So as you look at how this whole process is unfolding, we got a challenge with rural crime. We have accepted that on our end. We have a challenge with Indigenous crime in our Indigenous community. We have a challenge with city crime, where many of our families in the cities are being impacted. So what do we do to affect change in ensuring that we have the proper measure to reduce that crime overall? Well, Mr. Speaker, there's a myriad of opportunities attached to how we can reduce that crime overall. And again, this government has not responded in any way, shape, or form. Instead, what they have done is they put forward bills like this that is simply intended to divide the province and not strengthen the players to make sure that we're all part of the solution. Isn't our provincial motto, from many people's strength? From many people's strength. Now, I want to take one point when you talk about the FSIN, where they have steadfastly stood up and said, look, you guys need to consult us. We need to be part of the discussion here. The SAS party said no. The Minister of Justice said no, we're not going to consult with you. So they're sitting on the sidelines as far as this minister is concerned. For what reason, Mr. Speaker, for what reason? It is meant to divide the province, not unite the province. The Minister of Justice should involve all the people of this province in something that is fundamental to us all. The protection of our home, the safety of our families. We all need that, Mr. Speaker. But the Minister of Justice chose not to do that, which is a real shame. Now, Mr. Speaker, the initial reaction that people have is, well, is this constitutional? How does this affect the relationship between all the peoples of Saskatchewan? How do we make our community, our province strong? We involve everyone because we come from many people's strength, Mr. Speaker. We have this democracy in Canada that came from many people's sacrifices, including the non-Indigenous community, but including the Indigenous community, Mr. Speaker. So as we build and forge a stronger community together, should we not unite and should we not build from many people's strength? Now, I would suggest to the people of Saskatchewan this. As an Indigenous member of this Assembly, Mr. Speaker, it pains me greatly when I see that China is canceling the canola imports that we send. It's about $2.5 billion a year that China purchases from Canada. Does it affect me as a northern Indigenous person? Absolutely it does. I don't like seeing that happen to our farm community because the farm community strengthens our province. So thereby they strengthen us. So do I like that happening? No, I don't. I don't like it one bit. But Mr. Speaker, nothing's being done by the current government. When I see that there's communities that have boil water advisories that aren't getting any help from this current government, does that affect me? Does that get me angry? The answer is yes. Again, going back to my principle that we are here to strengthen the province overall. Does that affect us? Absolutely it does, Mr. Speaker. The Indigenous reconciliation we talk about, Mr. Speaker, if that's not happening throughout the province of Saskatchewan, does it anger me? Absolutely it does, Mr. Speaker. So what my point is overall, Mr. Speaker, is that there are matters out there that are threatening Saskatchewan from abroad. There are some serious significant threats from outside our province's territory, Mr. Speaker. And this is where we begin to count on each other. This is where we begin to sit down and say, what can we do to strengthen our province overall? Now, many people in northern Saskatchewan, when you heard about the trespass law, they often ask the questions, well, have not forestry companies trespassed my trap line? One elder asked me that. He's been trapping this area for years. He goes in one day, and his trap lines are hanging on one tree. The rest of his trap line has been clear-cut. So he turns to me as his MLA and says, well, did he trespass my trap line? Don't I have an inherent right to trap in that area that I've trapped for years? Now, how about some of the commercial fishermen that have lived off commercial fishing for years? Some of them, most of them Indigenous, some of them non-Indigenous. Well, when they allocate a lake to a sport fishing lodge, does that affect them? Isn't that their area? Isn't that their territory, Mr. Speaker? Well, they claim it is. So you look at some of the issues around the basic principles of building cabins. We've lived in our communities for centuries, for years. Do we have a right to go and build a cabin a mile away from our homes? Well, apparently we don't. Well, are they trespassing us overall? Is the government trespassing us when they deny us opportunity to build cabins? So the Indigenous community, First Nations, and the Métis Nation argue these points. And Mr. Speaker, what's really amazing is several years ago, the minister, the controversial former Minister of the Economy, Mr. Speaker, he gave away forestry rights that 9 northwestern communities, northwest Saskatchewan communities owned. The northwest communities had a TSL, Mr. Speaker, and that gave them the right to harvest forestry around their area. And that area, the money they're going to generate from forestry activity would create jobs, would help us sustain an economy. Well, guess what? The Minister of the Economy, the former member from Kindersley, decides to give it to a company in BC, Mr. Speaker. So a forestry company in BC had the harvesting rights. Well, where was our rights? Where is our opportunity to harvest our backyard? So when do our rights begin, Mr. Speaker? When do we begin the process of being allowed to participate in the economy? Well, apparently, there's certain governments, in the Sask Party included, that are not giving the people of our province the opportunity. They're picking and choosing what they want and who the winners and who the losers are, Mr. Speaker. Now, I look at all of the challenges. Now, when I look at across the board, Mr. Speaker, when we talk about root causes, in Saskatchewan, we better start figuring out what our water management strategy is for years to come. It is the single most challenging problem we're going to have, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the agricultural community, is how do we manage our water supply for years to come? This government has not done a single thing about it, Mr. Speaker. It is the worst threat overall to the future of agriculture in the province, and they have done absolutely nothing about trying to figure out a water management strategy. Instead, Mr. Speaker, we have leadership coming from that area proposing bills such as Bill 160 that is meant to divide people, not deal with the issues, but create challenges amongst us. And I say to the people of Saskatchewan, the kind people, the people that know exactly what's at stake, that we needn't follow the direction that's been given to us by bills such as Bill 160. That we can forge a new relationship and a better relationship on the future of Saskatchewan based on the inclusiveness of everyone, Mr. Speaker. This bill does a great injustice to us as people, all of us as people. And the Minister of Justice to propose it adds insult to injury. Now, my point to the government is this, that you've got to have a grander vision and a greater plan on the future of Saskatchewan than proposing divisive, reactive bills of this sort that simply appease a small minority. Mr. Speaker, it is incumbent upon the governments to show that leadership, and this bill does not in any way, shape, or form provide that ability for us to build together. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've traveled the province of Saskatchewan for many years. Spent a lot of time in this assembly. I've seen the goodness of the people of Saskatchewan, the kindness, when people stop and help me when I'm stuck on the road, when people offer you a meal in their own home yard, and when they share with you their idea of how to build a greater, grander Saskatchewan. So, Mr. Speaker, I've been blessed with a lot of the goodness that the Saskatchewan people have to offer over time. And we do have a great, solid Saskatchewan population, Mr. Speaker. But there are those that wish to divide us, sometimes for cheap political theatrics, Mr. Speaker. And this bill is evidence, once again, of how division on their part simply is their objective, Mr. Speaker, not vision. So we need to replace the divisionary or the division style of politics that the Saskatchewan Party have with a visionary, common, good agenda that the people of Saskatchewan want. Now, I tell the people of Saskatchewan this. I remind them once again, we don't want to see any families offended, Mr. Speaker. People should have the right to enjoy the safety and comfort of their own home and not lose assets. But that goes for the rural families, that goes for the city families, and that goes for the Indigenous families. There's a lot of families in my community, in my constituency, perhaps in yours, that are good, solid Indigenous people. They're good people, Mr. Speaker, and they want to be part of the solution. But when a Minister of Justice, of all people, says to FSIN, to the Métis Nation, and to many other organizations, we are not going to consult with you because it doesn't help us to consult with you from the political perspective. We're going to put this wedge legislative agenda in place just to create more problems. And Mr. Speaker, that is a crying shame. That is a crying shame, because I've seen many organizations and many people help build this province through history, through some of my experience. And Mr. Speaker, it really pains me to say this today, but I want to point out that if I continue seeing that kind of politics coming out of the Saskatchewan Party, then you begin to question your role as an Indigenous person in this Assembly. When do we begin to count? When does our opinion matter? When does our economy start to get the attention it deserves? When do our families get the opportunity to become strengthened and strong, like the reconciliation point that we all talk about? So the point is, when you talk to the Indigenous community, you must include them. And the people of Saskatchewan would say yes to that. They're tolerant, hardworking, loving people. I've seen evidence of it in my time as an MLA. But the divisionary tactics of the Sask Party to make their own little political agenda, Mr. Speaker, that does a great disservice to that vision that many people had when our province was formed. So again, I point out that there are many things that the province of Saskatchewan should be focusing on. Losing a China deal is going to hurt people. Moving our oil to Tidewater is going to help people, so get it done. Engaging all people, including the First Nations and Métis people, is valuable. Exercise that opportunity. Let's be serious about Indigenous reconciliation. If you don't want to do it from the political perspective, do it from the economic perspective, because various reports point out that it's a $90 billion opportunity if you engage the First Nations and Métis people in the economy. $90 billion to the good, Mr. Speaker. So in the meantime, try and build on the consensus of the people of Saskatchewan, not simply react to a small legislative agenda that divides people and doesn't help them. That's not what my father envisioned when he served this country, or other people that served this country over time, Mr. Speaker. That's not what I envisioned when I became part of the provincial legislative assembly process. But I can tell you from what we can see from the Saskatchewan Party, Mr. Speaker, that their attempt to divide the people of Saskatchewan through legislative means such as Bill 160 is very small-minded, it's very narrow-minded, and Mr. Speaker, above all else, it is very damaging to our future as people of this province. We have a lot more to say about this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, and in committee we're going to be challenging the Minister of Justice on this, and I say, first point, shame on him as a Minister of Justice to bring this bill, this type of bill forward that tramples on the rights of many other individuals. We can build a greater province, Mr. Speaker, but we needn't have that kind of leadership because it hurts us all. So on that note, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 160.
The member from Athabasca has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 160, the Trespass to Property Amendment Act 2018. Is it pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 22, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill 161, the Trespass to Property Consequential Amendments Act 2018. Ms. Mowat.
I recognize the member from Athabasca.
Thank you very much. I noticed it with a few members from the Saskatchewan party that were humored by some of the comments and the issue that we made in relation to this particular consequential amendment act, Mr. Speaker. But I'd point out that that style of governing is not something that we should be encouraging as people of the province of Saskatchewan. And that's one of the points, Mr. Speaker, we obviously point out, is that we simply want to have a better vision, better plan, and follow our provincial motto, from many people's strength. So on that note, again, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 161, the Trespass to Property Consequential Amendment Acts 2018.
Members move to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debate. Item number 23, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill 162, the Irrigation Act 2018. Ms. Beck.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
It's been a long week, Mr. Speaker. It's don't have the spring in my step. Anyways, Mr. Speaker, I do appreciate the opportunity to rise to my feet and speak to Bill number 162, an act to promote and develop sustained irrigation and do the consequential amendments to certain acts. It's a very important piece of legislation, and as we all agree in this House, how we can diversify in a sustainable way agriculture in this province. We are very interested in doing it. Very thorough, and it's been a couple of decades since the last piece of legislation came forward regarding this, and I know that creating the infrastructure to make this happen is very, very important. This will be one, though, that could be fraught with a lot of unintended consequences. We see this with this government, who we have raised questions in the House around sweetheart deals or the impacts of big money. What does this really mean? What is going to be the way of making sure this is fair and that we use our water resources in a sustainable way? That in fact, that when we look at our water resources and we think that we have the South Saskatchewan, North Saskatchewan that come into the province, and particularly the south, and we have the Gardner Dam and the impact that it's had on the irrigation area in a very positive way. But the fact is that because of climate change, and you know, it's interesting that we have this debate now because of the impact of climate change and the long-range way the climate is now in a crisis, that in fact we are looking at drier times. What that means that the glaciers that feed our major rivers are in dire straits. And so what is the impact for all of this? And are we going to do it in a sustainable manner? This is one that we're going to be watching, and I think everybody in this province will be watching very carefully. I know our ag critic will have lots of questions on this bill, but it's one that I think, as our member from Athabasca has talked about, a strong water strategy. And one is that really focuses on the fact that water is a very fragile resource in this province, and one that cannot be taken for granted. That we look at how can we make sure that we are conserving and using our water as effectively as possible. So I hope when Minister of Agriculture was talking about the new technologies that have happened in the last 20 years, is it because of conservation? Is it more efficient, more effective? What does it really mean? And what kind of crops will we be looking at? So with that, Mr. Speaker, I just want to flag some concerns here, some concerns both in terms of the fragility of our water resources, also in terms of the vulnerability to make sure we allocate our resources, if the government is spending resources in this, that it is fair and not part of any big money deals or anything like that. That is very, very important. So we'll be watching this area very, very closely. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to be moving adjournment on Bill 162, an act regarding irrigation here in this province. I move adjournment. Thank you.
The members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 162. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion?
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 9, resume debate on the second reading motion on Bill 141, the Interpersonal Violence Disclosure Protocol Clare's Law Act. Mr. McCall.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is it's important, it feels important to stand up today and enter into debate on Bill number 141, the Interpersonal Violence Disclosure Protocol, more commonly known as Clare's Law, Mr. Speaker. And I know that for many reasons, members on both sides of this Assembly are happy to see us yet again raise the issue, and no one is satisfied with the current situation in this province with regard to our rates of domestic violence. It's been said many times, but I think we can't ever forget. Our rates in Saskatchewan are the highest amongst the provinces in Canada, and they are 2 times the national average. Again, Mr. Speaker, I love to stand up as much as anyone. I know members on all sides, when we're doing things that are great, to stand up and you know, crow about it and be proud of who we are and where we come from. But we can't let stats like that stand, and that has been the case for too long in this province, Mr. Speaker. So in that spirit, I would like to say that I am very, very pleased to see this bill in front of us right now, and it will have an impact, I think, for some women in the province and for some victims of domestic violence in the province, both male and female, in the province, and I think that is important. Mr. Speaker, what this law, many people in this Assembly and those who are reading or who are watching at home will be aware, this is the first time that this law has been introduced in a Canadian province. It comes to us from the UK. And I think all of us are able to empathize with a father whose beloved daughter is murdered by someone who should have treated them well, someone who they were in an intimate relationship with, Mr. Speaker. And one can imagine the importance of feeling like that death was not for naught, to feel completely dedicated to ensuring that it doesn't happen to another family and hoping to prevent a death of another young woman. And so with that, I commend that father. And I think, you know, that's how things often get changed, when someone, due to their tragedy, gets lit up and says that they're not going to allow that to stand anymore. So my understanding, Mr. Speaker, of this bill is that what it allows is for easier disclosure of information about those who have a history of abuse. So if someone has reason to suspect that they or someone that they love is or care about is in a relationship with someone who may be an abuser, that they would have access to that information about that person's prior offending behavior. And I think that is very important. I know when I used to work at the shelter, it was often the case that we would see 1 or 2 and sometimes more women come seek shelter at Regina Transition House who had all had the same abuser. So certainly it is the case that there are individuals out there who are serial abusers, and this is the instance in which this law will have impact for people who find themselves in that situation. That said, it's not a whole solution. This solution is it's a good start, and I know that from the folks at Paths, our critic who has been, I just want to say, our critic from Regina Douglas Park, who has been just an undying advocate, not just an advocate, a force for improving our statistics in and all sorts of adjectives, some of which I can and can't say on the mic, Mr. Speaker. She's gotten things done from opposition and with cooperation and of the government has ensured that not once but twice and hopefully 3 times her initiatives have been passed on the floor of this Assembly, and I want to give her proper credit for that. And I want to also acknowledge the very real, very public and tragic circumstances for members on the government side of the House with their staff person, their beloved staff person, who they saw. It really brought this home for them, Mr. Speaker. As I said, this is a problem that doesn't just live on one side of this Assembly, doesn't just touch families from a certain socioeconomic group or a certain portion of the province, but is something that we all have to come together to be very thoughtful and deliberate about employing measures, enacting legislation, larger community measures that actually moves the dial on that statistic. I do have some concerns, and I think that it's well established that this will not be a full solution. One of the things that we know about women who experience domestic violence is that it's not always the case that their abuser has had a history of abusing. I think sometimes we like to think about this as this is a thing that only bad people do, you know, good guys and bad guys. The fact is that domestic violence and abuse, it happens in homes where you'd never imagine that it was happening, to folks who are our neighbors, by folks who are our neighbors and who we consider to be friends and good guys, or good gals, Mr. Speaker. So it's not always the case that abusers have a long history of abusing, and it's certainly even less so the case that their abuse has been reported and prosecuted. This is a problem, domestic violence, that for many years was seen as a personal problem. I think, unfortunately, in some circles, that's still the case. This is something that happened at home and wasn't to be talked about. Thankfully, I think we've moved away from that, but there still is a stigma that exists, and there still are reasons, a myriad of reasons, that these crimes are not always reported. So that's one concern, why this will not be a full solution. This bill will not be a full solution to the problem that's in front of us. The other is, in order to access the registry, someone would have to have a reason to. They would have to recognize the warning signs of domestic violence. I'm not sure that we are at a place with regard to education about domestic violence and the warning signs that everyone is going to have that information. They're going to understand that the warning signs are warning signs of someone who's a potential abuser. I think many of us grew up with Disney princess films, certainly, you know, fairy tales, where a lot of the characteristics that we were taught were romantic. In this context, actually, are signs of potential abuse. Many abusers are very charming. They seek out their partner, they isolate them, they want all of the attention. Mr. Speaker, and initially, often in relationships, that looks like love, that looks romantic. It's often too late. We've established, there have been established relationships, children, joint purchasing of assets, when the abuse actually starts in earnest or the physical abuse starts, Mr. Speaker. So that's another concern. Not only does the abuse have to have been happened before, have been reported and be in the registry, it also has to be recognized, I think, often at an early stage in a relationship for this law to pertain and be preventative. That said, it is an important step. It's one thing that is happening, and I know that there will be questions. I commend the fact that we are debating this on the floor of the Assembly, and I will say full stop, it doesn't go far enough. And I again want to just lift up my colleague for her good work, and the colleagues on this side who, I've told this story before, but I'm going to tell it again. When I left the shelter, just before I was elected in 2016, I said to my director, I promise you that we will bring this up in the House. And rightfully so, we have brought it up a number of times in the House, and I attribute that to the good work of my colleagues on this side, and a number of folks on the other side who I know champion this cause as well. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I think I've concluded my remarks, and we'll move to adjourn debate on Bill number 141.
Members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 141. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 133, the Legislative Assembly Election Dates Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Peterson.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to be speaking to this issue today, Bill number 133, an act to amend the Legislative Assembly Act 2007. It's probably one of the most controversial bills of the legislature, of this session, of this term, and simply changing the date. But of course, we talked a little bit about this yesterday. What are these folks thinking over there in terms of hurting the democratic process? We want to make sure people have access to their democratic right of voting. You know, when I look at the member of the Deputy Premier, and of course he has a perplexed look. Of course, it's sort of like the quote I used yesterday by Upton Sinclair, when people are paid not to understand. It often, and this is something, what I see on that front bench there, in the second row, they seem not to be able to understand what this does to our democratic processes when you're jamming two dates together. And of course, it's all very telling. It's very telling what the minister said. You know, the municipal folks wanted their election in the fall, and then they said, so did we. So there you were. They were going to get their way. They weren't going to go out and talk to the people of Saskatchewan. They weren't going to go out and find out what makes this easier for you to vote. What they want to know, what makes it easier for them to win. That is what they are interested in. The long and the short of this is they want to, you know, and it seems to be a way with the right wing. You know, we see this across North America, where you have a real movement to really get people frustrated with the democratic process, so they'll stop voting. You know, I was talking to the kids today, and I said, what we really want to do is make sure you vote. Make sure you vote. That's what we want to see happen. We want to see the participation rates go up. We want to see them go up for the municipalities, and we know that they're pretty low there. You're talking about 30 or 40%, you know, and that's really a shame. And ours, we're floating around 60, 70%. Of course, for federal is much higher. It would have made so much sense to do the democratic thing and have the election 4 years after the last election. Not 4.5 years after the election. 4 years. Now, they pride themselves on math. They can count backwards, but can they know what 4 and 4 and 4 means? You know? Yeah, now they're pointing over here. I don't know what they're You know, but the fact of the matter is it would have been so much more sense to do it in the spring of 2020, Mr. Speaker. That's plain math. Now, the Minister of Education prides himself on how he can listen, and he doesn't tell or he doesn't lecture. But the fact is we have a long, strong tradition in Canada of elections every 4 years. What's hard to figure out about that? Unless you're being paid not to understand this. Yeah, there, I think this is the thing. This is, yeah, that you guys don't quite catch the drift of long traditional. Listen, they're having a hard time dealing with this because it makes them very uncomfortable. It does. So that's what happens over there when they get very uncomfortable. You see, they get their back up, they get pretty upset, and as if they have some this is the height of arrogance, or arrogance, when they think they can just dictate what they want to do without going to the people. Every 4 years is the tradition in Canada. Is it not? Is it not? Yes. So they're going 4.5 and 4.5, so they get an extra year out of this. So, Mr. Speaker, I think this is an important issue. I think this is very important. Bill 133 is critical.
I'm unsure. Are you wanting the Speaker to enter into a debate? Because I won't be entering debate.
Using dramatic pause?
Well, thank you for the dramatic pause, but I'd ask that you stick with the bill that you're debating. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker. So here you go, Mr. Speaker. The utter lack of respect on that side for the democratic process. They show it every day. They're completely arrogant about this. And here, this is the height of arrogance of how they're treating our municipal cousins in terms of setting their dates. They are saying, you just have to live with bad legislation. You know, this is not the first time in Saskatchewan where these guys have hoisted bad legislation on the people of Saskatchewan, and I bet it won't be the last time, and they simply don't care. They sit over there with their smug look on their face and say, live with it, live with it. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry if it makes some of them uncomfortable over there, but that's how I see it. This is a bad piece of legislation. We should be going to elections in the spring of 2020, and this is one we'll have lots of questions in committee, but they'll have to answer the people of Saskatchewan sooner or later on this. Mr. Speaker, I move adjournment on this bill. Thank you.
Members move to adjourn debate on Bill number 133. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders.
Government House Leader.
Now adjourn for the day.
It's been moved by the Government House Leader that this House now adjourn. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried. This Assembly stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.